Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. I was sitting at home alone. The only sounds in the room were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. It was late, probably close to midnight. I had spent most of the evening watching TV and scrolling mindlessly through my phone, not really paying attention to anything. I didn't have much planned for tomorrow, and the peaceful quiet was something I was starting to enjoy. I had just gotten comfortable sitting back on the couch when my phone suddenly buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, blocked. My first instinct was to ignore it. I wasn't a fan of talking to strangers, and it was late. But for some reason, I picked up. I didn't recognize the area code, but it didn't seem too out of place. Maybe someone from a city? I pressed the phone to my ear. For a few moments, there was nothing. Just the faintest background noise like static. I waited, half expecting the call to drop. But then, from the other side of the line, a voice whispered, so soft it almost didn't seem real. "I see you." My blood ran cold. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, trying to process what had just happened. My hands felt clammy, but I put the phone back to my ear, my breath shallow. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the silence of the room. No response. The line was eerily quiet again, save for the faint sound of someone breathing, slow, steady, like they were waiting for something. I felt a chill settle over me. I quickly hung up, my heart racing, trying to push away the unsettling feeling creeping over me. Maybe it was a prank call. I had heard of people doing weird things like that, calling just to mess with you and hanging up without saying anything. I tried to shake it off, but as I set the phone down on the coffee table, it rang again. I didn't want to answer, but curiosity gnawed at me. I picked it up again, slowly this time, almost afraid of what I might hear. No words came through this time. Just breathing. Heavy, slow, steady. I glanced at the caller ID. It was blocked, but the area code, my area code, was the same as my own city. My stomach twisted. I had lived here for years and had never gotten a call like this before. I felt suddenly very aware of the silence in my house, the way the air seemed thicker now, pressing in on me. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows just out of view, but there was nothing. The breathing continued, coming through the phone, filling the space between us like a presence I could feel, even though there was no one there. My hand trembled as I held the phone to my ear. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a weird glitch, a strange coincidence. But my gut told me something wasn't right. I could hear the steady rise and fall of the breaths on the other end of the line, the sound unnerving in its quiet intensity. I hung up again, feeling the sweat bead on my forehead, my body tense and alert. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police, but the other part, the logical part of my brain, kept telling me that there was nothing they could do. I had no idea who was on the other end of the line. It could be anyone, right? Someone messing around, or maybe even someone who had dialed the wrong number. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I set the phone down on the coffee table again, this time not wanting to look at it. But my eyes couldn't help themselves. I stared at it, as if willing it to stop ringing. But it didn't. The phone rang again, and I froze. It was the same block number, the same area code. This time, I didn't pick it up right away. I stared at the screen for a long time, my fingers hovering over the call button. The breathing was still fresh in my mind, each slow inhale and exhale seeming to echo in my skull. I had to know who was behind the calls. I couldn't just sit here and let this continue, right? But the fear was holding me back, twisting my thoughts into knots. I answered the phone, but this time I didn't speak. I just waited. The breathing was there again, just as steady, just as unnerving. It was impossible to tell how long it had been going on. Maybe it was a few seconds, maybe it was minutes. I felt the pressure building in my chest, suffocating me. I glanced nervously at the clock. It was almost 12:30 a.m. I was alone. The silence in the house was so absolute that it felt unnatural. There was no traffic outside, No sounds of the neighbors. It was as though the whole world had gone silent. I heard a noise from the other side of the room, a soft scuffing sound like something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped again, and I immediately whipped my head around to look. Nothing, just the quiet hum of my house. I had to have imagined it. But then it came again. This time it was louder, closer. I stood up, my legs shaky, as if my body wasn't quite sure whether it should freeze or run. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, my phone still pressed to my ear, the breathing continuing, unbroken. It wasn't coming from the phone anymore. I could hear it in the house now, echoing in the empty rooms. I crept forward, my bare feet making almost no sound on the hardwood floor. My eyes darted around, trying to catch sight of anything out of place. The house was still and quiet, but my skin prickled as if I were being watched. I reached the stairs, my breath shallow, the only sound now the soft breathing on the other end of the line and the thudding of my heart in my chest. I made my way up the stairs, my hand gripping the railing as I moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The breathing was louder now, closer. It wasn't coming from the phone anymore, it was coming from down the hallway. I felt my stomach twist into knots. There was no way anyone should be here. I lived alone. I turned the corner, my eyes immediately darting to the darkened doorway of my bedroom. The door was ajar just slightly. That was odd. I was sure I had closed it earlier. I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the phone. I didn't want to go in there. I didn't want to find anything. But the curiosity was too much to ignore. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. My bed was undisturbed, the covers folded neatly at the edge. I stepped further into the room, trying to calm my nerves. But then something caught my eye. My window was slightly open, just enough to let a small breeze through. It was a chill that didn't feel right. I hadn't opened the window. I never opened it. I turned around quickly, my heart racing. The air in the house felt thick, as if the walls were closing in around me. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but the fear had already sunk deep into my bones. I glanced at my phone again. The call was still going, the same steady breathing filling my ear. But something had changed. It was no longer just breathing. I could hear the sound of soft footsteps now. Footsteps that were coming closer to me. I slammed the phone down onto the bed, my mind racing. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out of the house. I turned and ran out of the room, down the stairs, not caring about the noise I was making anymore. I grabbed my keys from the table near the door and sprinted outside into the cold night air. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. I don't even know how far I went, but I didn't look back. Eventually, I calmed down enough to call the police. I told them everything. The phone calls, the breathing, the footsteps, the open window. They came to my house and searched every room, but they didn't find anything. They told me it could have been a prank, that someone was messing with me. But I knew it wasn't. I knew that something was wrong. I could still feel it, that heaviness in the air. The way the silence had felt too loud, too thick. They told me to stay with a friend for a while, and I did. But every time my phone rang, my stomach dropped. Every time I went back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I couldn't help but wonder, was the caller still out there? Or had they just been a part of some twisted game? I never did find out. And after that night, I stopped answering block calls. I was alone, camping deep in the wilderness, a place so remote that cell service was a distant memory, and the only thing you could hear was the natural sound of the forest. I had been hiking for days, making my way through dense trees, across streams, and over rocky terrain. The solitude felt peaceful at first, just me and the open wilderness. But that peace was starting to feel fragile. Something about the air that night made me uneasy. I set up camp near a small clearing, the fire crackling as I cooked my dinner. I knew there wasn't anyone else around for miles. I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush, but otherwise, it was eerily quiet. The trees around me towered, their branches stretching toward the sky. their shadows casting long, thin fingers over the ground. It was beautiful, sure, but I couldn't shake this feeling something wasn't right. The sun sank lower and lower, and I felt the temperature drop. I had a solid fire going, so I wasn't concerned about the cold, but I kept my eyes on the woods beyond the edge of the clearing. The light from the fire flickered as I ate, casting strange shadows on the trunks of the trees, and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was soothing, almost comforting. Then, as the last of the light from the sun faded, I heard it. A distant howl. It wasn't the usual call of a wolf, though. It sounded off, too deep, too guttural. It wasn't the kind of howl you'd expect to hear echoing through the forest at night. I paused, my spoon hovering in midair as I listened. It wasn't a wolf. I had heard wolves howl before. This was different. It had a kind of heaviness to it, like something was pushing the sound out with force, something large. My mind raced through possible animals. A coyote? No, it wasn't high-pitched enough. A wolf? No, the sound was all wrong. I couldn't deny it. I felt a shiver of unease run down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just an animal I wasn't familiar with. I finished my meal, though it wasn't as enjoyable now that I had that strange sound in the back of my mind. The night stretched on, and the forest began to grow even quieter. There were no crickets or night birds singing. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush, and the steady crackle of my fire. I cleaned up my camp, stowed my food away in the bear-proof canister, and went to bed. As I lay there in my tent, the firelight from outside casting an orange glow on the fabric, the howl came again. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my heart thudding against my chest. It was no longer just an unsettling sound on the edge of my awareness. It was right there. The sound bounced off the trees, echoing in the quiet night, deep and throaty, like it was coming from something far larger than any wolf. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I lay still, waiting, listening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was it a bear? No, bears didn't sound like that. Was it something else? My thoughts spun out of control, and I pushed them away. I couldn't let myself get scared, but as the minutes passed, the howling grew louder and more frequent. They were circling. I could tell. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the thought that something was out there, moving through the trees, sent a wave of panic through me. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal. Just an animal. Then the howl stopped. The silence was suffocating. It was as though the forest had just paused. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. The kind of silence that made you question whether the world had stopped spinning. I couldn't hear anything now, not even the rustle of leaves or the creak of tree branches in the wind. I was still listening. The hairs on my arms were standing up, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Something wasn't right. I knew it. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the fabric of my tent, listening for any sign that the sounds were coming back. I kept my hand near the knife I had stashed in my gear just in case. The fire outside had died down to embers, casting faint, wavering shadows on the inside of the tent. I thought I saw movement outside, a dark shape just beyond the reach of the fading light, but I couldn't be sure. It could have been the wind. Minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. I began to hear things, faint creaks and pops from the trees, the occasional snap of a twig, but I couldn't be certain what it was. My thoughts twisted in the quiet. Was it just a deer, or was something bigger, something watching me? I strained to listen. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound from behind my tent, just on the edge of my camp. It was unmistakable. Something was out there, and it was close, too close for comfort. My breath hitched as I held perfectly still, my hand still gripping the knife. I could hear the sound of something large moving through the brush, the leaves crackling under heavy feet. Then another howl pierced the air, but this time it wasn't the same deep, guttural sound. It was sharp, high-pitched, almost like a scream. I bolted upright, heart racing. My mind was no longer trying to rationalize what was going on. There was something out there, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and pointing it toward the entrance of my tent. The beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Nothing at all. Still, I heard the movement, shuffling, scraping, the unmistakable sound of something large moving just beyond my sight. I could almost feel the weight of it out there, the pressure in the air as though the forest was holding its breath. I couldn't stay here any longer. I scrambled out of the tent, my legs shaky, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for my pack, trying to get everything together, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every rustle in the trees made my blood run cold. I couldn't see anything, but I knew, somehow, I wasn't alone. There was something out there with me. I grabbed my gear and, without thinking, bolted toward the nearest trail that led back to my truck. The flashlight bounced erratically as I ran, casting wild shadows on the trees around me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, faster. My mind raced, my thoughts clouded by fear, and all I could think about was getting out of the woods. The howls came again, this time louder and closer, almost as if they were following me, tracking me as I ran. I dare not look behind me. I kept running, my legs burning, the sounds of the forest fading into the background as my focus narrowed to one thing, getting back to the truck. The light from the flashlight illuminated the trail ahead, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the trees, just beyond the reach of my vision. When I finally reached the truck, I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack into the back and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled for the keys, hands trembling, and when the engine roared to life, I didn't look back. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped down the narrow dirt road, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground. As I drove, the howls gradually faded into the distance, though the hair on the back of my neck remained prickling with unease. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, never once glancing at the rearview mirror, my heart still racing in my chest. The road twisted and turned, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I made my way towards civilization. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station to refuel. The attendant looked at me strangely when I stepped inside, my clothes dirty and my face pale. "Rough night?" she asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I just paid for the gas, grabbed a bottle of water, and left without a word. I didn't need to say anything. The night spoke for itself, and though I made it out of the wilderness, the feeling never left. The howl, the silence, the deep primal instinct to run. Something had been out there, something that wasn't afraid to watch me, something I couldn't explain. I didn't go back to that area. I haven't camped in that part of the woods since. I still don't know what it was. I don't think I want to know. But one thing is for certain, whatever was out there, it was real, and it will always be a part of me. The wilderness doesn't forget. The wind was howling when I drove through the empty stretch of road. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the headlights of my car barely cut through the darkness. I had been driving for hours, looking for a place to stay, but every motel and roadside I passed had been closed or abandoned. My phone had lost signal miles back, and I was starting to worry I might have to sleep in a car, wet and cold, until I saw it. In the distance, through the mist and rain, there was a small, old building sitting alone at the side of the road. The lights were on inside, and there was a sign swinging in the wind, bed and breakfast. I didn't hesitate. I pulled into the gravel driveway and parked. The place looked old, maybe even from the early 1900s, but the lights were welcoming. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and hurried up to the door, knocking lightly, hoping someone was there. The door creaked open. An older woman greeted me. She had short gray hair, a thin frame, and eyes that seemed to have seen more than their fair share of things. She didn't say much when I asked for a room, just nodded and led me up the creaky stairs to a small room at the end of the hallway. I thanked her, dropped my bag on the bed, and stared out the window at the storm outside. The house felt cold, and the creaks of the floorboards as the wind howled through the house sent a chill up my spine. But I was tired, so I decided to get some rest. I pulled the heavy quilt over me and lay still, listening to the wind. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. A movement outside the window caught my eye, and I froze. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. It was pale, almost sickly white, and its eyes were dark, empty, and hollow. It was staring directly at me, not moving, just watching. The face was so close I could see the streaks of rain on the glass behind it, but the face itself remained still. My heart pounded. I couldn't move. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was taking over me. But no matter how many times I blinked, the face stayed. It was like it had been there for hours, its empty eyes locked on me, unblinking. I tried to look away, telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't. It was like it was pulling me in, holding my gaze in place. I lay there in bed, staring at the face for what felt like an eternity. The wind continued to scream outside, rattling the window, but the face was the only thing that mattered. My mind raced. Was someone playing a prank? But who would be out there, in the middle of the storm, standing that close to the window? No, this was something different. This was wrong. Finally, after what felt like hours, I forced myself to turn away. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But when I looked back at the window, the face was still there. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my flashlight from the nightstand. I walked slowly over to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I leaned forward. The face was gone. There was nothing outside, just the storm battering the glass. I breathed a sigh of relief, but then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The glass. It was covered in finger marks, wet and smeared, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the window and left them there. I traced the marks with my fingers, my skin crawling with each contact. It didn't make sense. The face was gone, but whoever had been out there had been so close, so very close. The marks weren't from the storm. They were too deliberate, too distinct. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I didn't know why, but something in my gut told me that staying in this room was a mistake. I quickly grabbed my things, tossed them into my bag, and made my way downstairs. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the woman again, standing by the door as if she had been waiting for me. Her eyes didn't seem surprised to see me in such a hurry. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. "Of course, if you need to leave, there's no need to explain," she said, her voice trailing off as she opened the door for me. I didn't say another word. I just hurried out into the rain and climbed into my car. As I pulled away from the bed and breakfast, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the darkness of the storm, swallowing the house whole. I didn't stop driving until I found a small town with a gas station. I pulled in, parked, and sat in the car for a while, trying to calm my nerves. It was only then that I noticed my hands were still trembling. I reached for my phone to check the time, but it was still out of service. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something had been watching me, waiting for me to leave that house. But I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the storm had gotten to me. I wasn't going to think about it anymore. But that night, when I finally made it to a hotel in the next town over, I couldn't sleep. The thought of that face pressed against the window haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see it, and I could still feel the cold, wet finger marks on the glass, as if they were imprinted on my skin. It wasn't until the next morning that I learned the truth. I had gone into the small diner next door to the hotel for some coffee when I overheard a conversation between the waitress and a customer. They were talking about the bed and breakfast I had stayed at. "You heard about the old house on the road?" the customer asked, his voice low. "They say it's been abandoned for years. The last people who stayed there disappeared. No one ever found out what happened to them." The waitress shook her head as if she didn't want to talk about it. "It's just an old place. No one really goes there anymore. Too much weird stuff happened around it." I didn't need to hear anymore. My stomach churned, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room I had stayed in, it had been a guest room, sure, but it was also the same room where the last visitors had stayed, the ones who had disappeared. I left the diner quickly, my mind racing. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to make sense of the pieces that didn't fit. But the thing that kept nagging at me was the finger marks on glass. Whoever had been out there in the storm had left something behind, and it wasn't just a trick of the light. Someone had been watching me, and maybe they hadn't been outside at all. I left that town as quickly as I could, and I never went back to that road. I don't know what happened to the people who disappeared, or why the old woman in the bed and breakfast never mentioned it. But I do know one thing. Sometimes when the wind howls late at night, I still feel the chill of those fingers on the glass, and I wonder if the face I saw was really just my imagination after all. I had always loved hiking, even as a kid. The idea of being out in nature, alone with my thoughts, was something I never got tired of. Over the years, I had hiked through forests, climbed mountains, and spent nights camping in the wild. But there was something about this particular trail, hidden deep in the mountains, that piqued my curiosity. I had heard about this secluded forest from a few people at the local outdoor gear shop. They spoke about it in hushed tones, almost like it was a place you were supposed to know about only if you were serious about the outdoors. The trees that were supposed to be massive, ancient even. Some of the locals claimed they'd never seen anyone else on the trail. Others spoke of it with a kind of reverence, like it was a sacred place. I didn't give much weight to those kinds of stories. Still, I couldn't help but feel a certain excitement stir inside me. A place so remote, untouched by tourists, seemed like the perfect escape. I packed my gear, filled up my water bottles, and set off early one morning before the sun had fully risen. I drove for hours passing small towns and then nothing but winding roads and thickening forests. The trailhead was marked by an old, weathered sign that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. I was the only one there, as expected, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me as I began my hike. The air was cool, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. The trail was narrow and wound through thick underbrush, and the trees here seemed different. Larger, older, their branches stretching high above, blocking out most of the sunlight. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice the strange silence. It was so quiet, almost unnaturally so. I wasn't used to hiking in places that felt so still. It wasn't the peaceful stillness I was used to, where you could hear the wind rustling the leaves or the occasional bird calling out. Here, there was nothing, not even the sound of insects. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just used to the noise of more popular trails. But the longer I walked, the more the silence pressed on me, like it was too much, too heavy. The trail itself was uneven, the ground soft underfoot, as though the forest floor had never been disturbed. The deeper I went, the more the feeling of being watched crept over me. It wasn't an overt feeling, more like a subtle discomfort, a chill running up the back of my neck every so often. By midday, I had made my way through the thickest part of the woods and found a small clearing. There was a massive tree in the center of the clearing, its trunk thick and gnarled, roots twisting out of the ground like serpents. It seemed like a good spot to set up camp. I dropped my pack, laid out my tent, and made a small fire. The sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt good to be settled for the night, away from the noise of the world. I sat by the fire for a while, eating a simple meal and listening to the crackle of the flames. As the darkness deepened, I realized just how quiet it was. There were no animal sounds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. The only noise was the occasional snap of wood in the fire. It was when I finally stood up to stretch that I heard it. A rustling noise came from the underbrush. It was faint at first, like the sound of leaves being disturbed, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. I froze, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. The noise was too rhythmic to be an animal, too deliberate. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, but it was getting closer, creeping along the edges of the clearing. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon looking for food, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. Then I heard the voice. It was low, soft, but unmistakable. "Leave this place." The words echoed through the clearing, not from any one direction, but all around me, as though they came from the very trees themselves. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood completely still, straining my ears for any more sounds. There was no movement in the underbrush anymore, just the chilling silence that had returned. I looked around, trying to find someone, anyone who might have spoken, but I was alone. The only movement was the smoke from my fire drifting into the dark. My first thought was that it was someone else, a hiker, maybe, but I quickly discarded the idea. If there had been someone here, I would have seen them. I had been alone in the clearing for hours, and the rustling had come from too deep in the woods for anyone to just appear. I felt my pulse quicken, and a sense of unease settled into my bones. I stepped toward the fire, grabbing my flashlight and shining it toward the underbrush. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly turned in a circle, trying to catch a glimpse of anything moving. The silence pressed down on me again, thick and suffocating. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. This wasn't right. I knew this place was isolated, but I had never felt this kind of isolation before. The voice wasn't some random animal or wind. It had been too clear, too intentional. It was a warning, but from whom or what? I decided to leave. I had come to enjoy the solitude, but this felt off. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I shoved my gear into my pack. The whole time, I kept hearing that voice in my head, "Leave this place," over and over, like an echo that refused to fade. Just as I was about to zip up my pack, I heard the rustling again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I whipped around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the noise. Nothing. The clearing remained still, the trees standing like silent sentinels. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I hurriedly grabbed my things. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I couldn't shake the image of someone or something lurking just beyond the trees, waiting. My breath was shallow as I fumbled with the tent, trying to collapse it, trying to move faster, but it was like my body refused to cooperate. The fire crackled behind me, but the shadows in the clearing grew deeper, as though the darkness itself was closing in. I turned to face the trail, grabbing my pack and running toward the path. The air felt colder, and the rustling behind me started again, louder this time, as though something was moving in pursuit. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo off the trees, mixing with the faint rustling that followed. I pushed harder, my legs burning, but it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. The trail stretched on endlessly, and the trees seemed to close in, narrowing the path. I kept expecting to see something, someone, waiting in the dark ahead, but there was nothing. The rustling stopped, but the feeling of being hunted, being watched, didn't. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my lungs burning with each breath, my legs shaking from exhaustion. The night air was cold against my skin, and the forest behind me was silent again, but I didn't dare turn back. I didn't care what it was or why it had warned me. I just needed to get out. I loaded up my car in a daze, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I drove away, my eyes fixed on the winding road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the main highway and the last signs of civilization, I breathed a sigh of relief. But even then, the feeling of that voice lingered, echoing in the back of my mind. Leave this place. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what it was, whether it was some strange trick of the mind, a warning, or something more, but I do know that I'll never forget the way it felt to hear that voice in the woods, a voice that seemed to come from the very earth itself, telling me to leave. And I did. The first time I read about the tunnel was in an old urban legend book I found at a secondhand store. It was one of those books that looked like it had been passed around from one person to the next for decades, with frayed edges and yellowing pages. Most of the stories seemed like nonsense, designed to keep people up at night, but one stuck with me. It described a forgotten tunnel beneath the city, an underground maze that few people knew about, and even fewer survived to tell about. The legend claimed that the tunnel was connected to an old hospital, long abandoned, that had been built in the 1800s. But after it was shut down, The tunnel was sealed off and forgotten by everyone, except for the ones brave enough to go looking for it. I couldn't shake the idea. I've been to a lot of places around the city, always searching for something new and different to explore. But this tunnel sounded like the kind of thing that would be worth finding. The thought of it haunted me for weeks, and I finally decided that I was going to go find it. I spent hours researching, combing through maps, old newspaper articles, and talking to anyone who might know anything about the city's history. There were no real guides, no GPS coordinates. All I had were some old descriptions, vague mentions of streets and landmarks, and a deep curiosity that gnawed at me. The more I looked, the more obsessed I became. On the day I finally set out, the weather was gray and heavy, with clouds clinging low to the horizon. It felt like the air itself was thick with the promise of something. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It wasn't the kind of thing I wanted to explain, and I knew if I did, I'd be convinced out of it. The whole thing was reckless, but something in me couldn't let it go. The entrance wasn't easy to find. It took me hours of walking through narrow alleys, crawling under fences, and squeezing through gaps in buildings. The city had changed over the years, and what had once been part of a lively area was now a forgotten part of town, derelict and crumbling. The streets had grown quiet, and most of the buildings were abandoned, with windows boarded up and doors rusted shut. I finally found it hidden behind an old iron gate, overgrown with ivy and weeds. The gate was locked, but with a little effort, I managed to wedge it open just enough to slip through. The tunnel's entrance was small and narrow, carved into the side of a hill that was now part of an industrial district. It looked ancient, like something out of a storybook, but real enough to make my heart race. The darkness inside was suffocating. I fumbled with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness in sharp, jagged slices. The air was damp, thick with the smell of mold and something sour, like the rot of forgotten things. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was nothing in the tunnel with me. Just the echoes of my footsteps and the distant drip of water from somewhere deeper in. I kept walking, the tunnel winding and twisting like a snake beneath the city. The walls were wet with condensation, slick with years of decay. I had to be careful not to slip on the uneven ground, my shoes squelching through the damp, cold dirt. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. My breath came out in short, shallow gasps, my skin prickling from the chill of the underground. I didn't know how long I'd been walking, but the tunnel seemed endless, stretching on forever with no sign of any exit or change. It felt like time had stopped down there. My flashlight flickered a few times, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die on me completely. I checked the battery, only to find it was still fine. It was just the flickering of the old, cheap flashlight playing tricks on me. And then I saw it. A door, half hidden by overgrown vines that had crept down from the ceiling, the wood rotting and splintered. It didn't belong there, not in this place. The tunnel had no doors, just walls of stone and concrete, rough and uneven. But this one was different. It looked like something that had been forgotten, something that had been sealed off long ago and left to be consumed by the years. I hesitated for a moment, standing there in front of it, the unease crawling up my spine. I don't know what drew me to it. Maybe it was the curiosity, maybe it was the promise of something unknown. But whatever it was, I couldn't resist. I reached out and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, loud in the silence. The door swung wide, revealing a small room on the other side. The air inside was even more stale, a thick, cloying scent of dust and decay filling my nose. My flashlight caught the outlines of old furniture, a single bed with a frayed, faded blanket, a wooden chair, and a mirror hanging on the far wall. The room was so small, so cramped, and yet it felt impossibly vast, like the walls were closing in on me. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled on the dust-covered floor. The door creaked shut behind me, and I spun around, almost expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But the room was empty, just me and the unsettling quiet. I moved toward the mirror. It was old, the edges of the glass fogged with age. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at my own reflection. The dim light from my flashlight made my face look pale and drawn, the shadows under my eyes darker than I remembered. The mirror was framed in dark wood, chipped and worn, like it had been there for years, untouched. As I stared at myself, something strange happened. My reflection didn't move with me. I shifted slightly, raising my hand to run it through my hair, but the reflection stayed perfectly still. I frowned, confused. Maybe it was just the odd lighting, or maybe the mirror was warped, but for a moment, it felt wrong. I took a step closer, leaning in to get a better look. That's when I saw it. My reflection smiled. A slow, unsettling smile that didn't reach my eyes, like someone was trying too hard to look friendly, but failing miserably. My heart skipped a beat, my stomach dropping. It wasn't me. It couldn't be. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. But my reflection didn't move. It just stood there, smiling, no grinning, widely now its eyes black pits of emptiness. The more I stared, the more the face seemed to twist, the grin pulling back unnaturally, like the muscles in its face were stretching beyond what should have been possible. I felt bile rise in my throat, my chest tightening as the smile grew wider, almost grotesque. And then the eyes, those dark, soulless eyes, began to shift. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of there. The face in the mirror twisted again, the features distorting, pulling and stretching as if something was trying to climb out of it. I staggered backward, my hand grabbing for the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. Panic began to flood my body. I yanked harder, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming faster and faster. But the door wouldn't open. The figure in the mirror was still smiling at me, its eyes hollow and empty, like it was mocking me. The reflection began to reach out toward me, its hand pressing against the glass, the fingers curling in a grotesque, unnatural way. My own hand shot up to my mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to burst from my throat. The thing on the other side of the glass was no longer just a reflection. It felt like something more. I didn't know what to do. Every part of me was screaming to get out, but I was trapped. I glanced around the room in a panic. There was no other way out. I wasn't even sure how to explain this, how to make sense of what was happening. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the mirror's figure stopped. The twisted face relaxed, the eyes no longer dark and soulless. The smile faded, and the hand that had been pressing against the glass dropped limply. It was still me, still my reflection. The door handle turned easily in my hand, and this time, when I pulled it open, it didn't resist. The hallway outside was as silent and dark as I remembered. I stumbled through, my heart racing, my mind spinning, and I didn't look back. I don't know what happened in that room, or why the reflection changed like that. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, maybe it was something else. But I never went back. I don't think I'll ever go back. Some things aren't meant to be explored. Some doors, once opened, are better left closed forever. I had just moved into a new neighborhood. It was quiet, the kind of place where people waved to each other on their morning walks and where the streets felt safe. The houses were spread out enough so you didn't feel crowded, but close enough that you could wave to a neighbor without feeling like you were intruding. I've been looking for a fresh start after a rough few years, and this seemed like the perfect place. I'd found a small, cozy home on a corner lot, surrounded by trees and with a nice porch that overlooked the street. It was everything I'd hoped for. When I first moved in, the only person to greet me was Mrs. Hale, the elderly woman next door. She was in her late 70s, maybe even early 80s, with a frail, hunched back and thin, graying hair that barely touched her shoulders. She had this slow, deliberate way of walking, as if each step was carefully measured. But despite her age, there was something sharp about her eyes, something that made her seem like she was always watching. Still, she was kind when she waved to me that first day. She smiled, and I waved back, a little awkwardly, still adjusting to the new place. Over the next few days, I settled in, unpacking boxes and figuring out where to put everything. The neighborhood was exactly what I'd wanted, peaceful, calm, and the kind of place where nothing too exciting ever happened. It was easy to forget I wasn't the only one living here. But as I spent more time outside, I started noticing something odd. Every night, at precisely the same time, I'd see Mrs. Hale standing in her front window, staring out into the darkness. The first few times, I thought it was just a coincidence. But it didn't take long before I realized that this was a nightly ritual for her. No matter what I was doing, whether I was sitting on my porch or getting ready for bed, I could see her silhouette in the window across the street. She never moved, never blinked. It was as if she was waiting for something, her face always fixed, her eyes locked on the dark street. At first, it was easy to brush it off. I thought maybe she was just an older woman with odd habits. Maybe she couldn't sleep or she liked to watch the world at night. But after a few days, something about it started to feel unsettling. It wasn't just that she stood there. It was the way she never seemed to blink, how her eyes never shifted, never moved. She'd stare straight ahead, her face expressionless, and I started to wonder what was going on in her mind. Was she lost in thought, or was there something else? I didn't talk to her much after that first day. I saw her walking around her house from time to time, but she never really initiated any conversation. I'd wave, she'd wave back, and that was it. I try not to dwell on it too much, but something about her presence gnawed at me. She was a figure that seemed to loom larger than life in the quiet of this sleepy neighborhood. It wasn't until about a week later that things started to get even stranger. I was sitting on my porch one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. I had just cracked open a beer and was taking in the night air when I saw her. Mrs. Hale was standing in her window, just like always. But this time, something was different. She wasn't standing in her usual spot. No, this time, she was standing in the very middle of the window, her face pressed up against the glass. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and she was staring straight at me. For a moment, I felt my heart race in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but it was as if she was watching me, not just looking out at the night. It was a sharp, intense stare, like she was seeing right through me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she had just noticed me sitting there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I felt like she was studying me, like she was waiting for something to happen. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the strange sensation that I was being watched more than I should be. My instincts were telling me to look away, but I couldn't. Something about her gaze made me feel rooted to the spot. I finally forced myself to get up and go inside, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, I decided I would try to introduce myself properly. I had already waved at her a few times, but I hadn't had the chance to actually meet her. Maybe she was just lonely, or maybe she had lived in the neighborhood for so long that she didn't know what else to do. Whatever the reason, I figured it was worth a try. I walked over to her house around noon, the sun high in the sky. Her house was as quiet as always, but I could see the faint flicker of movement inside. I knocked gently on the door, unsure of what to expect. It took a few seconds before I heard the shuffle of footsteps coming from inside. When the door finally creaked open, Mrs. Hale stood there in her usual faded dress. Her eyes were wide open, and for a moment, I thought she hadn't seen me. But then she blinked, and her gaze fixed on me. Her pupils seemed unnaturally large, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me. I tried to smile, but the look in her eyes made it feel forced. I opened my mouth to introduce myself, but before I could say anything, she whispered, "I'm not supposed to talk to you." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I froze, unsure of how to respond. Her voice was soft, almost a rasp, but the way she said it was firm, as if there was something weighing on her. Without another word, she quickly shut the door in my face. I stood there for a few moments, not knowing what to make of it. The door was shut, and I could see through the small crack in the curtains that she was still inside, her silhouette barely visible. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had a strange, sinking feeling in my stomach. What had just happened? Why had she said that? And why did she look so scared? The next morning, I woke up to an eerie silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes your skin feel tight, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. I looked across the street, expecting to see Mrs. Hale standing in her window as usual, but this time, there was nothing. Her house was dark, the blinds were drawn, and there was no sign of her at all. It was as if she had disappeared overnight. I didn't know what to think. I'd spent the whole night turning her words over in my mind, trying to make sense of them. "I'm not supposed to talk to you." What did that mean? And why did she look so afraid? The days passed, but I never saw her again. I walked past her house a few times, but the windows were always shut and there was no sign of movement. I knocked on her door a couple of times, but no one answered. It was like she had simply vanished. Weeks went by, and still there was no sign of her. The neighborhood seemed quieter without her strange presence, and eventually I began to think that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe she had just been an eccentric old woman who didn't know how to interact with her neighbors. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, something I didn't understand. One day, I decided to do a little research. I visited the local library, asking around about Mrs. Hale and her house. The librarian, a quiet woman with silver hair, looked at me with a strange expression when I mentioned Mrs. Hale's name. "You didn't know?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head, confused. "Mrs. Hale passed away about a year ago," the librarian said. "Her house was left empty ever since. I'm surprised you didn't know, with her being such a fixture in the neighborhood." I felt my blood run cold. There had been no mention of her passing in the papers. No notice, nothing. She had been gone for over a year, and yet I had seen her standing in her window every night for days after I moved in. I didn't know what to make of it, but as I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched once again. The air was still, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the trees. The neighborhood seemed just a little too quiet, just a little too empty. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I never saw Mrs. Hale again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been trying to tell me something before she disappeared. Whatever it was, I was never meant to understand. And maybe that was for the best. I had been hearing whispers for days. At first, I thought it was just the wind. Maybe it was the old house creaking, settling as the temperatures shifted. The house I lived in was old, creaky floors, rattling pipes, and drafts that made the windows groan like they were alive. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just wind anymore. They were voices. They came from the walls, soft and muffled, but unmistakable. A constant murmur, always there in the background, like a conversation just out of reach. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it was nothing. The house was old, and I was just hearing things. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to dismiss. It wasn't just random whispers anymore. There was a rhythm to them, an urgency. Sometimes they sounded like distant mutterings, like a group of people talking in another room. Other times they were closer, like someone was standing right behind me. I'd turn around quickly, my heart racing. But there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, the dim light from the kitchen casting long shadows across the floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At night, when I was trying to sleep, the whispers would grow louder. It felt like they were moving through the walls, like they were circling me, getting closer and closer. I'd lie in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was something in the house watching me? One night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know what was going on, even if it meant confronting whatever was causing the voices. I wasn't going to let this drive me crazy. I had to know if I was losing my mind or if there was something else happening. It was late, well past midnight, when I got out of bed. The house was dark, silent except for the faint sound of the whispers that had been growing in intensity all evening. I walked down the hallway slowly, trying to stay calm. The air felt thick, heavy like it was pressing in on me. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, making me feel like I was the only living thing in the house. As I reached the hallway, the whispers seemed to come from behind the walls. They were clearer now, almost like they were right next to me, just on the other side of the drywall. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The voices seemed to shift, moving, following me. There was no way I was imagining this. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to listen. The voices were so clear now, so close. I could make out words. Get out now." I pulled away from the wall in a panic, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers had stopped, but my mind was racing. What the hell was that? Was someone in the house? I looked around, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. But there was nothing, no one. Just the dim glow of the hallway light, the quiet creaks of the house settling. The silence was deafening now, but it felt wrong, too calm. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. My pulse raced, and my hands trembled at my sides. The house felt like it was closing in on me, like it was breathing with me. Then, I heard it again. The whispers. They were louder now, more insistent. They moved through the walls like they were alive, shifting from room to room. It was as if they were following me, surrounding me, whispering things I couldn't understand. But the one thing that was clear, louder than anything else, was the message. Get out now. I backed away from the wall, my head spinning, my thoughts a whirlwind. What the hell was happening? I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't just the house creaking or the wind blowing through the cracks. This was something else, something that was in the house with me. I turned, my heart racing, and hurried down the hallway to the living room. The house felt cold now, the warmth of the evening completely gone. I flicked on the light, scanning the room, looking for any sign of movement, any clue as to what was going on. But everything was still. The couch sat there, untouched. The old wooden floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved further into the room, my mind buzzing with fear. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. I sat down on the couch, trying to gather my thoughts. Was I going crazy? Could this all just be in my head? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was in the house with me. I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from every corner. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress getting to me. Maybe I hadn't been sleeping well. Maybe I was just overreacting. But the more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the more real the whispers felt. They weren't just voices. They were a warning. I sat there for hours, the fear creeping into my bones, my mind racing. I couldn't stay in the house, not with those voices. But I couldn't leave either. I was trapped by my own mind, by the house, by whatever was haunting me. I finally decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and rushed to the door. I had to get out. The air outside felt cold and fresh, a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. I slammed the door behind me and stepped out onto the porch, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to calm myself. The night was quiet, too quiet. The wind had stopped, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the trees in the distance. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I had to get away from that house. I didn't know what the whispers meant, or who, or what was in the walls with me, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't stay in a place that felt like it was alive, like it was watching me. I didn't look back as I walked away from the house. I didn't want to see what was behind me, what was still lurking in the shadows. I didn't want to know if it was following me. I never went back to that house. I moved to a small apartment a few days later, trying to put everything behind me. But every now and then, I hear whispers, just faint enough that I think I'm imagining them. I try to shake them off, tell myself they're just the wind or the pipes or the house settling. But deep down, I know the truth. There was something in that house, something I couldn't explain. Something that was watching me, waiting for me to leave. And now that I'm gone, I wonder, who will the whispers call the next? I had been hiking for hours, taking the well-worn trail through the thick pines of the mountain range. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of crisp fall day where the leaves had already begun their slow transformation from green to vibrant oranges and reds. The kind of day that felt perfect for being outdoors, alone with nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. I was used to the solitude of the trails. It was my preferred way to clear my head and disconnect. The trail itself was nothing special, just a narrow path winding through the forest. But as I made my way farther into the mountains, something seemed off. The forest was eerily quiet, and the air felt heavier, thicker. It wasn't just the weight of the silence. It was like the landscape itself was holding its breath. I had hiked out this far before, but this section of the forest felt different, like something had changed, or maybe something had been waiting here all along. I pushed those thoughts aside, chalking it up to my imagination running wild. The mountains have a way of doing that to you. But it wasn't long before something caught my eye. Nestled in the trees, just off the main trail, was a structure I hadn't noticed before, a small cabin. It was weathered, clearly abandoned, and appeared to have been there for quite some time. The logs that once made up its walls had rotted in places, and the roof sagged in a few spots where the wood had given in to years of neglect. I was surprised I hadn't noticed it on previous hikes, especially since it wasn't that far off the beaten path. But here it was, almost hidden by the thickening underbrush. I wasn't one to shy away from exploring, especially when it was clear no one had been around in years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way toward the cabin. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked under my weight. I hesitated for a moment, the floorboards groaning like they were about to give way. But I took another step and pressed forward. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly from its hinges. A gust of wind pushed it open a little wider, and the sound of it creaking in the breeze sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way the door moved didn't seem natural, but I brushed the thought aside and pushed it open a little further. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and the faint, musty scent of old wood and decay. The first thing that caught my eye was the broken windows, shattered glass littering the floor, sunlight streaming through the gaps in the walls, casting strange, jagged shadows. I stepped inside carefully, my boots crunching on the glass and debris. The floor was uneven, the walls peeling, and everything inside looked as though it had been left behind in a hurry. There were remnants of old furniture, a chair toppled on its side, a wooden table covered in layers of dust, a bed frame stripped of its mattress. It felt like time had stopped inside this place, like it hadn't seen a human touch in decades. I moved cautiously through the cabin, scanning the space for anything that might give me clues about who had lived here or why they left. On the far wall, strange symbols had been carved into the wood. They were crude and jagged, not resembling anything I recognized, but they seemed deliberate, like a warning of some kind. I ran my fingers over them, the carvings deep and worn from years of neglect. It gave me an unsettling feeling, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't have found. I stepped further into the room, my attention drawn to the floor. More symbols, this time larger and more intricate, were etched into the wooden planks. Some looked like animal tracks, others like twisted shapes I couldn't quite make out. There was something eerily familiar about them, though, like they had been carved with a purpose. A knot twisted in my stomach, but I ignored it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Still, my instincts were on edge, and I felt an uneasy weight pressing down on me as I explored. The air grew heavier as I made my way toward the back room. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a low hum seemed to vibrate in the walls. I couldn't place it, just a faint, almost imperceptible sound, but it was there. As I reached the doorway to the back room, the growl came. It was a low, guttural sound, more felt in my chest than heard, like something primal and dark had just awakened. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I froze in place. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the cabin behind me. But there was nothing but the dust, the broken furniture, and the empty space. No person, no animal. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the growl didn't come again. I told myself it was just my nerves. The cabin was old. The wood creaked, and the wind could play tricks on you. But even as I convinced myself of that, I felt a growing unease settle in the pit of my stomach. It was the kind of feeling you get when, deep down you're not truly alone. The air was colder now, and it seemed to press in on me from all sides. The hairs on my arms were standing up, and I felt like I was being watched. I stepped back toward the door, but something caught my eye in the corner of the room. A dark shape just at the edge of the window's light. My eyes darted toward it, but the figure disappeared before I could fully register it. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right here, and I didn't need to stay to find out what it was. I turned to leave, but stopped in my tracks when I heard the growl again, this time closer, almost behind me. It was like it was in the walls themselves, vibrating the very air. My breath caught in my throat, and instinct kicked in. I bolted for the door, but as I reached it, the temperature dropped even further. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. It was as if something was closing in on me, something that had been waiting, hidden, until I stumbled into its territory. The door creaked as I pushed it open, but it didn't give way as easily as it had before. My heart raced as I shoved it harder, finally forcing it open and stepping out onto the porch. The woods outside were silent now, the earlier quiet unnerving in its stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that something had been waiting for me to leave that cabin. As I made my way back toward the trail, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The cabin stood there, unchanged, the doors swinging slightly in the wind, as though it were watching me. I didn't stop hiking until I reached the trailhead, my feet aching, my mind racing. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, but nothing was there. The mountains were as silent as ever, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I never did find out who had lived in that cabin or why they had left. I never went back, and I never spoke of it again. But every time I hike in the mountains now, I can't help but wonder about the growl I heard that day, about the strange symbols, about what might still be out there, waiting in the woods, in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. I've learned to trust my instincts more since then, and sometimes when the wind blows just right, I can still hear that growl. And I know, deep down, that I wasn't the only one there that day. I had been driving all day. The road stretched out in front of me like a ribbon unwinding in the endless desert. I just come off a long stretch of backcountry, and my legs were sore from the ride. The plan had been simple: find a remote site, camp, and enjoy a peaceful night under the stars. Just the kind of break I needed. So when I saw the sign for the campsite, I knew I was in the right place. The turnoff was unmarked, the road barely visible, just enough of a dirt path to let me know someone else had been here before. I drove slowly, careful not to jostle my gear in the back of the truck. It had been a long trip, and I wasn't in any rush. The trees were thick around me, tall pines that towered above, their dark silhouettes cutting into the pale sky. The road narrowed as I pressed on, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires the only sound to break the heavy silence. This place was far from anything. No noise, no light, just the quiet murmur of the forest. Finally, I reached the campsite. It wasn't much, just a small clearing at the edge of a creek. The area was isolated, tucked away from any nearby roads or trails. I parked and turned off the engine. The peace of the place settled over me like a blanket, and for a moment, I just sat there, taking it all in. I had come here for solitude, to get away from the noise and stress of the world. And for the most part, that's exactly what I got. It was perfect. I got out of the truck and started unpacking my gear. The tent went up first, a quick job as I spread it out on the ground, securing the poles. I set up the camp stove next, my cooking gear, and made sure I had enough water for the night. It was a clear evening, and the air was crisp but not too cold. By the time I had everything set, it was getting close to dusk. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, and the sky was turning a deep, rich purple. I made a small fire and sat beside it, watching the flames flicker and dance. Everything felt right, peaceful and calm. The world outside this little campsite felt miles away. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was a slight movement near the edge of the trees. Just a flicker in the corner of my eye, barely noticeable, but something about it made me stop and look. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line. There at the very edge of the clearing, just out of the light of the fire, stood a figure. I squinted, unsure if I was just seeing things, but no, it was definitely there. It was standing motionless, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought it might be another camper, someone else out here in the woods. I had seen a few cars on my way in, and there were no other campsites nearby, but sometimes people find their own spots, you know? I stood up and waved in that direction, a casual gesture, trying to let whoever it was know I was here. "Hey," I called. "You need something?" No response. The figure didn't move at all. No acknowledgement, no wave back. Just stillness. I felt a small knot of unease in my stomach, but I shrugged it off. It could be someone just not in the mood for company. Maybe they were lost in thought or dealing with something personal. I called out again, louder this time, but still no response. I took a step forward just to see if I could get a better look. The trees were dense where the figure stood, and it was difficult to make out any details. But I could tell one thing for sure. It was standing still, like it had been there for a while, unmoving. Then, slowly, the figure began to move. It took a deliberate step forward, not a natural, casual movement, but something slow and measured. My heart skipped a beat. Something about the way it moved made my blood run cold. The figure was coming closer, stepping out from the trees into the faint light of my fire. I could finally see him more clearly. The person, or whatever it was tall, maybe 6 feet, dressed in dark, worn clothing. A heavy jacket that looked out of place in this weather, long pants, and boots that were muddy as though they had been trudging through the underbrush for hours. But it was the face that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't normal. The face was pale, too pale, like someone who hadn't seen the sun in a long time. It was gaunt, hollow, as though the skin was stretched too tight over the bones. The eyes, those dark eyes, were wide open, unblinking, and sunken deep into the face. The mouth twisted into a grin, but it wasn't the kind of grin that came from joy or amusement. It was twisted wrong, like it was pulling itself into a smile that didn't quite fit. I froze. I couldn't move. My body went stiff, my mind struggling to process what was happening. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. Maybe the firelight was playing tricks on me, but no. This wasn't a trick. This person, this figure, was standing in front of me, and it was terrifying. The figure didn't say anything. No words. No sounds. It just stood there, its wide, dark eyes locked onto mine. The grin never faltered. It raised a hand slowly, and my blood turned to ice. The air around us felt heavy, like the atmosphere was thickening. The figure's hand hovered for a moment, and then, without warning, the night was filled with an unsettling silence. No sound from the forest. No rustling leaves. No crickets or distant animal calls. Just a hollow quiet. I wanted to run to grab my things and get in the truck and drive as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground, my chest tight, breath shallow. The figure took another step forward, its boots crunching on the gravel, and my mind screamed at me to do something, anything. But I stood there, frozen. Then it stopped. The figure was now standing just beyond the reach of my firelight, close enough that I could see the details of its face. The twisted grin, the hollow eyes, the deep lines in the skin. It was a face that didn't look human, not entirely. I realized something then. This wasn't some lost camper or hiker. This wasn't someone just passing through. No, this thing didn't belong here. It wasn't part of this world, or at least not in any way I understood. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it, but something inside me snapped. The urge to survive finally pushed through my fear. Without thinking, I turned and ran fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I sprinted to my truck, hands shaking as I grabbed the door handle, yanking it open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tires spinning as I shot down the dirt road. I didn't stop, not until I was far enough away that the silence of the woods was replaced by the distant hum of the highway. The night felt normal again, like I was finally back in the world I knew. I drove straight through the night, not once looking back. I couldn't. There was something deep inside me telling me that if I turned around, I'd see those eyes again, those hollow, unblinking eyes, and that twisted grin. I didn't camp again for months after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that face in my mind. Every creak of a tree, every snap of a twig in the distance made my heart race. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left me. But one thing stayed with me more than anything else: the silence. The heavy, unnatural silence that fell over everything when that figure raised its hand. The silence that was so deep so complete, it felt like the world itself had stopped just to watch me. That silence still lingers in the back of my mind, a reminder that some things out there aren't meant to be understood, and some things should never be seen. I had heard the rumors. Everyone who lived around here knew the story of the haunted trail. People had gone in, but they never came out. The names were always whispered, like some sort of warning. Asterisk, don't go there. No one returned star. I was skeptical, of course. The logical part of my brain told me there had to be a rational explanation for all of it. Maybe a few people got lost. Maybe they were in some kind of trouble. But curiosity, the kind that gnaws at you until it demands attention, led me to the path one foggy afternoon. I hadn't planned on going at first. I was just out for a walk. The air was damp, heavy with mist that hung low, clinging to everything like a wet blanket. I had always heard about the trail, its eerie reputation, but I never thought much of it. After all, it was just a trail in the woods. Would it go wrong? But that day, the fog was so thick it felt like it swallowed the world whole. I had been walking for about an hour, taking in the cool air and the sounds of the forest, when I spotted the old, worn sign, the one that warned people not to venture into the woods. The faded letters barely legible, but I knew what it said. Asterisk trail closed. Dangerous area. Enter at your own risk. Asterisk, I should have turned around right then. But I didn't. I took a step closer, almost instinctively. The more I looked, the more I could feel something pulling me in. My feet moved on their own, like I was drawn toward it. My stomach twisted, but I ignored it. I kept telling myself there was nothing to fear. It was just an old path, just a trail through the woods. But as I walked further in, that uneasy feeling started to crawl up my spine. The trees around me seemed taller than usual, their trunks thick and twisted. The fog hung so low that I could barely see the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't just the mist that was oppressive. It was the silence. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in a breeze. It was as if the world had muted itself, and I was alone in some forgotten corner of the earth. I pressed on, thinking that maybe I was just letting my mind get carried away. It was easy to start imagining things when you were alone in the fog with nothing to distract you. But then it happened. A sound. Footsteps. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was walking behind me. I turned my head, but all I saw was fog, thick and unyielding. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a deer or a rabbit, something harmless. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming closer, slower, until they felt like they were right behind me. I turned again, my pulse quickening. There was no one there, just the fog and the trees stretching out in every direction. My breath felt shallow now, my hands clammy as I gripped the straps of my backpack. I started walking faster, the sound of my own footsteps now mingling with the other ones that still followed me. Whoever or whatever was back there, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time, almost as if they were toying with me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I thought I might have been hearing things, or maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But no, the footsteps didn't stop. They were real. I could hear them clearly, as though someone was just a few steps behind me, keeping the same pace. I quickened my own steps, trying to outrun the noise, but it only got louder. Closer. I reached for my phone, thinking I might be able to call for help. But of course, there was no signal. I wasn't surprised. No one around here had any reception once they ventured too far into the woods. My phone felt like a useless piece of plastic in my hand. I shoved it back into my pocket, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. The footsteps behind me didn't falter. They were still there, moving with me, never breaking rhythm. I glanced over my shoulder again, and this time I thought I saw a figure through the mist. A dark shape just beyond the reach of the fog, standing still. I couldn't make out any features, but the figure was unmistakable. Someone was there, watching me. I felt my stomach drop. I could barely breathe. Panic began to settle in, and I picked up the pace, my legs moving faster, trying to break free from whatever this was. I didn't know if it was a person or some animal with a twisted mind, but I had to get out of there. My feet moved faster, and I was almost running now, heart pounding in my throat. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, matching my pace perfectly. The figure in the fog was still there, or maybe it was something else. I couldn't bring myself to turn and look again. I didn't want to know what it was. The trees closed in tighter, their limbs tangled like gnarled fingers reaching down at me. The air felt heavier, the mist thicker. The deeper I went into the woods, the more it felt like I was being swallowed whole by the forest. And still, the footsteps followed. I could feel the panic building inside me. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let whatever was behind me get any closer. I turned sharply, trying to find any way out of the woods, but the fog only grew thicker, and the path ahead seemed to disappear into nothing. I stumbled, tripping over a root hidden in the underbrush. My knees hit the dirt with a sickening thud, and I gasped for air. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking as I tried to stand. The footsteps didn't stop. They were still coming, closer now. I could hear them, like heavy boots crunching through the leaves. My mind raced. I couldn't keep running like this forever. What was I supposed to do? I was lost, and the fog was swallowing me whole. My heart hammered in my chest as I fought to stay calm. I had to think. I had to. Then the footsteps stopped. A chilling silence fell over the woods. It was deafening. My pulse still throbbed in my ears, but for the first time, the sound of the forest was gone. It was like someone had turned off the noise, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stood frozen, my body tense, waiting for whatever was next. But nothing came. No more footsteps. No sound at all. I couldn't move. I couldn't make myself look behind me, but I knew deep down I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. My skin crawled as I stood there, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. And then, out of nowhere, the fog began to lift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mist started to pull back, like a veil being lifted from my eyes. The trees were still there, the path still winding through the forest. And in the distance, I could see the clearing I'd been looking for. It wasn't far, just a few hundred yards. A break in the trees where the fog hadn't reached. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't care anymore. I didn't look back. I just ran, the air sharp in my lungs, my legs burning from the effort. The fog was thinning now, and I could see the trail ahead of me, clearer and clearer with each step. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, and finally, the silence was broken. The woods around me seemed to breathe again, as if they had never been still in the first place. I collapsed on the ground, my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. I looked around. I was out. I had made it. The footsteps, the figure, everything, it was gone. There was nothing left but the whisper of the wind through the trees and the sound of my own racing heart. I didn't waste any more time. I turned and walked quickly out of the woods, never once looking back. As I emerged from the trees and onto the main path, the sun broke through the fog for the first time that day, warm light spilling onto the earth. And I was glad to be out, glad to have made it out of that damn trail. But I'll tell you this, I never went back, and I never will. Some paths are better left untrodden. Some woods are better left unexplored, because sometimes what follows you in the fog is something better left behind. I had always been told not to go into the attic. It was one of those rules in the house that my parents made very clear. The attic was off limits. The door at the top of the narrow staircase had always been locked. I never understood why they kept it that way. It wasn't like our house was some ancient mansion with hidden secrets. It was just a two-story, post-war home, nothing special. Yet, the attic was always off limits, and that made it all the more intriguing to me. Growing up, I'd occasionally ask why we couldn't go up there, but my parents would always give me a vague answer. It's just for storage, my mom would say, or my dad would mutter something about keeping old things hidden away. I never gave it too much thought, though. Kids are curious, but they forget things. At least, that's how it was for me. It wasn't until I hit my teenage years that the curiosity started to gnaw at me again. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe it was the way the door creaked when I passed by it. The way the air around it always seemed colder. Or maybe it was the fact that I'd been stuck at home for weeks with nothing to do. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in that attic. Something that didn't belong. One evening, when I was 17, I found the key. It was tucked away in a drawer in the kitchen. It was an old, rusty key, the kind you could tell had been around for decades. At first, I wasn't sure what it was for, but as I held it, something clicked in my mind. The lock on the attic door. It had to be the key to that. I felt a rush of excitement flood through me. I don't know why, but I knew this was my chance to figure out what was up there. The house was quiet that night, my parents having gone out for dinner. My heart pounded as I stood at the base of the stairs, the key cold in my hand. I stood there for what felt like a long time, listening to the stillness of the house. No voices, no sounds, just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Finally, I made my way to the attic door. I slid the key into the lock, and it turned with an old, groaning sound. The door swung open with a reluctant creak, revealing a narrow staircase that led up into the darkness. The air felt musty, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I hesitated for a moment, the silence pressing in around me. But curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped inside. The stairs were creaky, and I felt them groan under my weight as I ascended. The climb seemed to take longer than it should have. The attic felt distant, far away from the rest of the house. The air up there was thick and dusty, and I coughed a little as I reached the top. The only light came from the small, dusty window at the far end of the room, casting dim, yellowish light over the space. The attic was exactly as I'd imagined it, filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. Stacks of cardboard boxes were piled haphazardly in corners, some with faded labels, some without. The smell of old paper and mildew lingered in the air, and I had to brush aside cobwebs to make my way further into the room. My eyes swept the room, searching for anything that stood out. The place was a mess, and it was clear that nothing had been touched in years. But then, in the far corner of the attic, I saw it. A wooden chair, positioned oddly by itself in the corner, facing the middle of the room. And sitting on that chair was a doll. It wasn't a particularly remarkable doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked in places, and its clothes were tattered and worn. But there was something about it that made my stomach churn. The doll's eyes were wide and glassy, its gaze fixed directly ahead. But what bothered me the most was the way its eyes seemed too lifelike, too real. It didn't look like a doll that had been left up here for years. It looked like it was waiting for something. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I've been expecting dust and old furniture, not something so unsettling. I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I approached the chair. The doll's eyes remained fixed on the space in front of it, unblinking. It was just a doll, I told myself. Just an old, creepy doll that had been forgotten here. But as I reached out to touch it, something strange happened. The doll's head, slowly, almost imperceptibly moved. It wasn't a sudden jerk or a violent motion, but the head turned. Just enough so that its gaze was now fixed directly on me. My hand froze midair. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stood there, staring at the doll as it stared back at me. The room seemed to shrink around me, the silence thickening in my ears. My heart pounded, and my fingers went numb around the key I still held tightly in my hand. This wasn't right. The doll wasn't just a doll. It was watching me. I took a step back, my pulse racing. My mind scrambled for an explanation. It must have been some kind of trick. A draft, maybe? I looked around the attic, searching for something that could explain it. But nothing made sense. The doll was just sitting there, its eyes locked on mine, unblinking and unervingly real. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a shadow, a trick of my mind. But the feeling in my gut was growing stronger. The doll didn't belong here. It didn't belong in this house. I took another step back, but this time my foot caught on something, a box, I think, and I stumbled forward. My hand shot out instinctively to catch myself, and I ended up knocking into the chair. The doll's head turned further, its gaze following my movement. That was enough. I bolted for the stairs, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't even stop to look back. I just ran. The old stairs creaked beneath my feet as I rushed down them, and I slammed the door shut behind me as I reached the bottom. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt like the only thing holding me together in that moment. I stood in the hallway, gasping for air, my chest heaving. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I had to stop myself from looking back up at the attic door. But the thought wouldn't leave me. What was that thing up there? Why was it sitting alone in that chair, waiting? I didn't go back into the attic after that. I couldn't. The house felt different after that night. It wasn't just the attic. It was a whole house. It felt as if something had shifted. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the image of those glassy eyes, locked onto mine, as if they had been waiting for me to come upstairs all along. Years have passed since that night. I moved away to college and haven't been back to that house. I've heard my parents still live there, but I never ask about the attic. I don't even think I want to know what's up there. But there's one thing I'll never forget. The way that doll's eyes followed me as I backed away. The way it seemed to move slowly, deliberately, as if it knew exactly what I was thinking. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed a little longer? If I had dared to reach out and touch it, would I have learned the truth? Or would it have been the last thing I ever did? I had just moved into the house, a charming old Victorian with tall windows and intricate woodwork. It wasn't the kind of house I had ever pictured myself in, but the price was right, and it had that certain something that made it feel special. The floors creaked as I walked through, the smell of old wood and dust lingering in the air, reminding me of childhood visits to my grandmother's house. Everything about it seemed steeped in history, like it had stories to tell, but I hadn't yet learned its language. It was late one evening when I decided to explore the basement. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house was quiet except for the occasional groan of the old beams shifting. The house, I quickly realized, had a life of its own, one that seemed to change with the time of day, sometimes creaking and cracking as if stretching after a long nap, other times feeling uncomfortably still. The basement door caught my attention that evening. It was tucked away at the end of the hallway, hidden behind a narrow doorframe. It looked different from the other doors in the house, almost as if it had been added later. The paint on the door was chipped, and the metal handle had been worn smooth by years of use. When I gripped the handle, it was cold to the touch, and the moment I pulled it open, I felt a draft, a cold rush that seemed to come from nowhere, pushing past me into the warmth of the hallway. The door groaned as it swung wide, the wood complaining against the hinges. I hadn't planned to go down there that night, but something about the basement drew me in. I reached for the flashlight I'd been carrying since I'd moved in, just in case I needed it, though I hadn't used it yet. The light from the beam flickered at first, but then steadied, casting a narrow path of light down the stairs. I took a deep breath and started down. The stairs were steep, they were slippery with age. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me, the space feeling smaller with every step. As I descended, the air grew colder. I could hear the faintest sound, like the whisper of wind, but muffled, as though something was hidden in the walls. My footfalls echoed as I moved further into the dark, the flashlight's beams struggling to pierce the shadows. The further I went, the less I could make out. The beam of light danced along the uneven walls, the cracks in the plaster, the dust motes floating like tiny specters in the air. My mind raced with thoughts of the house's history, how old it was, who might have lived here before me, and what had been left behind. At the bottom of the stairs, the floor was concrete, cold beneath my sneakers. The basement stretched out in front of me, vast and empty, save for a few old boxes stacked against the walls, a broken chair, and something else, something I hadn't noticed at first. A wooden box sat in the farthest corner, tucked behind some dust-covered furniture. It was odd that I hadn't seen it immediately. The basement was dim, but with a flashlight, I should have noticed it. I took a step toward it, my curiosity now outweighing the unease creeping up my spine. The box was old, too. Its wood was darkened with age, the edges worn and chipped. It sat slightly ajar, the lid cracked open just enough for me to see inside. I couldn't make out what was inside, but as I moved closer, I heard it, a faint whispering, almost like a voice, but not quite. It was soft, just barely audible, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze. The whispers continued, as though coming from deep within the box. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't figure out what it was. Was it the wind? Was there something alive in the box? My mind raced through all the possibilities, but none seemed to make sense. I felt a strange sensation, as though the room itself had grown heavier, the air thicker, like something was watching me. I turned to leave, but before I could take a single step, the whispering stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was sudden, as if whatever had been causing it had simply decided to go quiet. The silence that followed was so oppressive that I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, like I was caught in a moment between waking and sleep, where everything feels just a little bit off. Still, something kept me rooted to the spot. I didn't want to go, not yet. My eyes drifted back to the box. There was no logical reason for me to stay. Nothing about this made sense, and every instinct in my body told me to leave, but there was something compelling about it. The curiosity clawed at me, tugging at the edges of my mind. Against my better judgment, I approached the box again. I bent down and reached for it, my hand trembling slightly as I touched the lid. It was cold. The box itself felt heavier than it should have, as if something inside had sunk into the wood, pushing against it. I lifted the lid just a fraction more, trying to catch a glimpse of what might be inside. The moment I did, the whispering began again, louder this time, but still faint, almost unintelligible. It sounded like a jumble of voices, overlapping, each one talking over the other. I couldn't make out a single word, but the tone, it was a sound I couldn't ignore. I jerked my hand away, panic surging through me. The hairs on my neck prickled, and my heart raced in my chest. I should have left. I should have bolted up the stairs and never looked back, but the fear held me in place, frozen in the cold air of the basement. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though they were calling to me, trying to pull me in. My head spun with confusion. The voices, the box, the cold, everything seemed wrong. But I couldn't tear myself away from the box, no matter how much I wanted to. It was as if some force beyond my control was holding me there, pushing me closer, making me listen. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of old magazines that had been stacked against the wall. I caught myself just before I hit the ground, my flashlight falling from my hand and rolling across the floor, casting erratic shadows. I looked back at the box one last time, and this time I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The lid was now fully open. I hadn't done it. The lid had opened on its own. Fear gripped me, and I turned and ran, not daring to look back. My breath was ragged, my footsteps clumsy as I stumbled up the stairs. I could feel the cold air from the basement wrapping around me, but I didn't dare slow down. When I reached the top, I slammed the door shut behind me, breathing heavily, my heart thundering in my chest. I stood there for a long time, my back pressed against the door, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What had I seen? What had been in that box? The whispers echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, something that had been waiting. I didn't go back down to the basement for the rest of the night. And the next morning, I made sure to check that the door was locked, though I knew it wouldn't keep anything out. I had to know what was in that box, but I wasn't ready to face it again. Not yet. Days passed, and the house seemed to settle back into its old rhythm. But I couldn't forget what I'd experienced. The whispers, the cold, the feeling that something was watching me. It haunted me, even in the daylight. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights, I decided I had to go back. I had to know what was in that box. But when I opened the basement door again, I found it empty. The box was gone. I never did figure out what happened that night. But the one thing I knew for certain was that whatever had been in that box, whatever had whispered to me from the darkness, was not something I could understand. And I knew then that some things are better left untouched, better left unexplored. The house, it seemed, had its secrets, and it wasn't about to share them with me. I didn't stay long after that. I moved out a few weeks later, not because of the box, but because something deep inside me told me it wasn't a place I should be. I never spoke of it again, but every now and then, when the wind blows just right, I hear those whispers again. They've never stopped. We had been hiking all day, our boots crunching the dry leaves and twigs that covered the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of fresh, earthy smell you can only get when you're deep in the woods. I was used to the quiet solitude of the forest. My friend, Jake, wasn't so much. He had only recently started coming with me on these trips, and I could tell he was still getting used to the isolation. But tonight, something felt different. The weight of the woods seemed heavier, almost suffocating. We had been on the trail for hours, trekking through dense thickets over streams and around boulders, all the while pushing ourselves deeper into the woods. The plan was simple: find a clearing to camp for the night and get some rest before we hiked out in the morning. It was late afternoon by the time we reached the edge of a small, secluded clearing. The last rays of the sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. It looked like the perfect spot to set up camp. I dropped my pack on the ground and started unpacking the tent, while Jake wandered off to collect firewood. The place was quiet, almost eerily so. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, squirrels rustling through the leaves, were strangely absent. The air was still, the only movement coming from the occasional breeze that stirred the treetops. I had grown used to this kind of silence, but Jake seemed a little more on edge than usual. The sun finally dipped behind the trees, and the night sky quickly settled in. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could feel the coolness in the air. The wind picked up a little, rustling the branches overhead. The fire crackled to life as Jake returned with an armful of wood, and we sat down by the flames, eating the simple meal I had packed for us. As we ate, the darkness seemed to close in around us, the forest stretching out like a black ocean. It was then that I heard it, a faint, desperate cry for help. At first, I thought it might be the wind playing tricks on my ears, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it was a voice. A child's voice. The cry was weak, filled with fear and panic, but it was unmistakable. It sent a chill through me, something primal in the back of my mind telling me that this wasn't something normal. I looked over at Jake, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he, too, heard the sound. We both stood up, looking around the clearing, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It wasn't close. It sounded like it was deeper in the woods, maybe half a mile away, but the woods here were dense, and sound had a strange way of traveling. The voice sounded so close, like it was just on the other side of the trees, but when I focused, I could hear nothing but the wind and the crackling of the fire. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice a little shaky. I nodded, my stomach tightening. "Yeah, a kid. Sounds like they need help." Without a second thought, we grabbed our flashlights and started toward the source of the sound. I didn't even stop to think about the risks, the dangers of hiking through unknown territory at night. I just kept moving, following the sound as it grew more distant, more faint, but still there. The forest around us seemed to shift as we walked. The wind picked up, howling through the branches above, making the trees creak and groan. Every now and then I would hear a snap of a twig or a rustle in the underbrush, but when I would turn, there was nothing there. The darkness in the woods was absolute. My flashlight barely cut through it, illuminating only a small patch of the path ahead. The sound of the crying was growing fainter, and with every step, it felt like we were chasing it further and further. It was like the child was moving away from us. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. A child shouldn't be out here this far from civilization. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest road or town. The air around us seemed heavier, thick with a strange sense of urgency. We kept walking, pushing through thick brush, and the forest closed in around us like it was trying to swallow us whole. The cries became more sporadic, as if the child was wandering in circles, or worse, running. The woods had that oppressive, silent quality now, making the occasional snap of a branch sound like thunder. Every footstep felt like it echoed through the trees, and the oppressive feeling in my chest kept growing. The last thing I wanted was to end up lost out here at night, but something kept pulling me forward. And then it happened. The crying stopped. 1 second, it was there, faint but desperate, and the next it was gone. The sudden silence was deafening. My heart thudded in my chest. I stopped dead in my tracks. My flashlight bounced wildly as I swung it around, trying to make sense of the dark. What the hell? Jake muttered, his voice shaky. He was right behind me, but his words barely broke through the tension in the air. I strained to listen, hoping to hear the child again, but there was nothing. No crying, no sound. Only the wind and the soft rustling of the trees. I motioned for Jake to follow me, my stomach twisting into knots. We had to find out what was going on. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I didn't know what. We pushed forward, moving slowly, carefully scanning the shadows around us. The further we went, the more unsettled I became. The woods were completely silent now, save for the wind. No animals, no insects, nothing. We reached the edge of the woods, and the trees opened up to a small, wide space. The forest was thicker here, the moonlight barely making it through the canopy above. I looked around, scanning every inch of the clearing with my flashlight. There was no sign of anyone, no child, nothing. I turned to look at Jake, who was scanning the woods in the opposite direction. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something heavy breathing, right behind us. I froze. The breath was loud, ragged, and deep, like something large was standing just behind us, watching. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was there, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my legs unwilling to obey. I could hear Jake breathing heavily beside me, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The sound was closer now, too close. It was right there, just behind me. I slowly turned my head, my heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight flicked over the trees behind us, but there was nothing, just shadows, just darkness. Jake was still staring in the opposite direction, his face pale. He didn't see it either, but something was there. I could feel it, something large, something powerful. My mind raced with possibilities, and none of them were good. I swallowed hard, fighting the panic creeping up my throat. We needed to get out of here, fast. I grabbed Jake's arm and yanked him toward the edge of the woods, my flashlight darting back and forth, scanning the trees for movement. The heavy breathing continued, but I couldn't see what was making it. It was so close that I could almost feel the heat from whatever it was. My mind screamed that we needed to move, but my legs refused to cooperate. I heard a rustling behind us, followed by a sharp snap of a twig. It was almost like something was following us, just out of sight. We moved faster now, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I tried to keep my bearings. Every step seemed to echo in the stillness, and the breathing seemed to get closer, closer. And then, just as we reached the edge of the forest, it stopped. The breathing, the rustling, everything, gone. We broke out into the open field, and I turned, my flashlight scanning the dark trees once more. Nothing, just shadows. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my body was trembling, but I couldn't help but feel that we were safe now. Whatever had been following us was gone. I didn't want to stick around to figure out what it was. Without a word, I turned to Jake and started walking quickly back to our camp. The only sound now was our heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. As we reached the clearing where we had set up camp, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The forest was silent again, the night air calm, but I could still feel it, whatever had been out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. I woke up in the middle of the night to an unnatural silence, the kind of quiet that seems so heavy it almost feels suffocating. I blinked, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The room was dark, but I could make out enough shapes. The dim outline of my dresser, the corner of the bedpost, the faint glow from the streetlights outside filtering in through the cracks in the curtains. My mind was still fuzzy from sleep, but something felt off. The air felt colder than it should have. I turned my head, my body stiff from the sudden wakefulness, and noticed the source of the cold. The window beside my bed was cracked open, just enough to let a thin stream of night air in. I could feel the icy breeze on my skin, sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could usually sleep through anything, but tonight my senses were heightened, alert to every little sound. I pulled the blankets around me tighter, but that did little to ease the discomfort creeping up on me. It wasn't just the cold or the strange quiet, though. Something else had my attention, something I couldn't quite place. It was like my brain was telling me that there was something wrong, but it was too blurry to figure out exactly what. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the details, the faint shadows stretching across the floor from the dim streetlights, the stillness of the room, the creaks of the house settling. All normal, yet my gut told me otherwise. I turned my head toward the window. The moonlight was spilling through, casting faint patterns across the wall. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I saw something, just a flicker of movement, something that shouldn't have been there. A shadow, tall and thin, stretching across the wall outside. It moved slowly, deliberately. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse quickening. I leaned forward, staring hard at the wall. There was no wind to make the tree branches sway. The shadow wasn't cast by any of the typical sources. There was no one out there. I couldn't hear anything, just silence, thick and unsettling. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, something primal stirring inside me that told me to get up and investigate. But at the same time, I couldn't make myself move. My legs felt like they were locked to the bed. The shadow continued to shift, moving across the wall as if it had a mind of its own, a slow and rhythmic pace that didn't make sense. I couldn't look away. I had to know what it was. The shadow seemed to stop suddenly, freezing in place. It was as though it knew I was watching, as if it was waiting for me to do something. A chill swept through me again, colder this time. I could feel the air around me thicken. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What was happening? I forced myself to sit up, the blankets falling off me as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. I stood slowly, careful not to make a sound. My feet hit the cold hardwood floor, the sensation shocking against the warmth of my body. I tiptoed towards the window, every step feeling like it echoed through the silence. As I moved closer, I could feel my breath catch in my throat, the air seeming thicker, harder to breathe. I reached the window, my hand hovering near the curtain. I didn't want to touch it. I was scared to. What if the shadow moved again? What if there was something worse out there, something I wasn't prepared to see? But I knew I had to know. I had to see it for myself. My fingers brushed against the curtain, cold to the touch. I slowly pulled it aside, peeking through the narrow gap between the fabric. The shadow was gone. The wall was empty, the moonlight shining cleanly through the window now. I stared out into the dark yard, straining my eyes. Nothing. The silence was absolute. No movement, no sounds of the night, nothing. I felt a sense of relief flood through me, but it was short-lived. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? My mind playing games with me in the dark? I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, lowering the curtain and backing away from the window. My legs were weak, and I could feel my hands trembling. I had to calm myself down. I was being ridiculous. It was nothing, just a trick of the dark, a shadow from the trees or the power lines. It was nothing, but the unease didn't leave me. As I turned to head back to bed, I paused. A sound, a faint noise like a soft thud, came from outside. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound was distant, but it wasn't just the usual creaks of the house or the wind. It was something else. It came again, louder this time, like something had knocked against the side of the house. My eyes darted to the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I slowly walked back toward the window, every step feeling like it took forever. My mind was telling me to stay away, but my body was already moving. I reached the window again, hesitating before pulling the curtain aside. This time, the darkness outside was absolute. The yard, the driveway, the trees, they were all shrouded in blackness. The only light came from the street lamp down the road. There was nothing, no shadow, no figure, nothing. But I knew, deep down, that something was out there. I could feel it. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to look outside anymore. I stepped away from the window, my back pressed against the wall, heart pounding. I glanced over at the door, considering whether I should check the rest of the house, make sure everything was locked and secure. But I already knew, if there was something out there, I wasn't going to find it in here. I couldn't. I felt like I was being watched, like I was being led into something I didn't want to see. The quiet was unnerving now, the kind of quiet that made my skin crawl, every creak in the house echoing in my ears. The minutes dragged on, stretching out forever. I finally decided to check the house, my nerves pushing me forward. I left the room, moving quietly down the hallway, checking each door. It was all in place. Everything locked, nothing disturbed. But that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I checked the front and back doors, peeking through the blinds each time. Both were locked. No one was around. I was starting to think I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just the wind or the way the moonlight played tricks on my tired eyes. But just as I was about to give up and head back to bed, I heard the sound again. This time it was closer, a sharp scrape against the side of the house, as if something had brushed against the wall, and then a quick, faint scurrying noise, like footsteps on gravel. My heart leaped again. I felt that gut-wrenching certainty that there was someone outside, someone close. I rushed back to the window, not caring anymore if I looked foolish. The shadow wasn't there anymore, but I wasn't convinced it had gone. I needed to know what was outside. I needed to see it for myself. I pulled the curtains apart once more, my breath shallow and rapid. I scanned the yard with frantic eyes, the darkness swallowing everything. Then in the dim light I saw it, a figure crouching low by the edge of the fence. It wasn't a shadow. It was a person, someone hunched over, moving slowly, deliberately. My blood ran cold. They were close enough now that I could make out their shape, their posture. A man, his face obscured by the night. My first instinct was to back away, to retreat to safety, but I stood frozen, unable to move. The man didn't seem to notice the light from the window. He was still watching the house, watching me. I knew he could see me too. My mind screamed for me to act, to do something. But all I could do was watch, my body rigid with fear. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he stood up and disappeared into the shadows of the yard, fading into the night like he had never been there at all. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was that? Why was he out there? I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my phone, quickly dialing the police. When they answered, I barely managed to choke out what I'd seen, my voice shaking. I kept my eyes on the window, my pulse thundering in my ears. The dispatcher assured me they would send someone over right away, but it felt like forever before they arrived. By the time they got here, there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been near the house at all. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. That man had been out there. The officers searched the area, found nothing. They even checked the perimeter of the house. But they couldn't find any signs of entry, any sign that someone had been watching me. The only thing left was the cold air from the window, still lingering in the room. I went back to bed that night, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay there, wide awake, listening to every little noise. I didn't dare close my eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about that man, about how he'd been right there, watching me. Even though the police didn't find anything, I knew he was still out there somewhere, waiting. The house was silent again, but it was different now. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, thick with tension. I kept the window closed from then on, and I never went to sleep without checking every door and window, making sure everything was locked tight. I never saw that figure again, but every time I hear a scrape against the wall or the sound of footsteps outside, my heart still skips a beat. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the feeling that someone... I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Midwest, seeking a little solitude in the woods. It had been a while since I'd had the chance to just unplug and unwind, and this spot seemed like the perfect place, remote, quiet, and far from the busy life I was used to. I found a small clearing near a creek, nestled deep in the trees. It was one of those places where the only sounds you hear are the rustling leaves and the occasional bird. The kind of spot where you'd almost expect to feel like you're the only person alive. I set up my tent, threw a tarp down to keep the ground dry, and hung my hammock between two sturdy oaks for when I needed a break. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air with a slight breeze that made the branches sway. I made a fire pit, gathered some dry wood, and before long, the crackling sound of the fire was the only noise besides the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustle of trees. By late afternoon, I had made a simple dinner of beans and rice over the fire, just like I usually did when I camp alone. The sun was setting, casting a golden light through the trees, and the air had a bit of chill to it, perfect for a quiet night in the woods. I sat back and enjoyed the peace, watching the sky slowly darken, the fire flickering in front of me. That's when I noticed the dog. It came out of the woods, emerging from the shadows just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it was a coyote or maybe a fox, but as it got closer, I could see it was a dog, a shaggy brown, medium-sized mutt. Its fur was matted and dirty, but it didn't seem to be in bad shape. It had no collar, no sign of any tags. It just sat down at the edge of the firelight, watching me with bright, curious eyes. "Hey there," I said, half expecting it to run off, but it didn't. Instead, it trotted over, its tail wagging, and sat next to me like it had been waiting to find someone. I didn't mind. I've always liked dogs, and this one seemed friendly enough. I gave it a scratch behind the ears, and it leaned into my touch, letting out a soft whine of contentment. It had the look of a dog that had been wandering for a while, skinny, scruffy, but with a certain kind of rugged charm. I shrugged and tossed it a bit of my leftover beans, figuring it had probably been hungry. It gobbled them up without hesitation, and I noticed a few more signs of its wild nature. Its paws were calloused, and its coat had bits of twigs and dirt tangled in it. It didn't seem like a dog that belonged to anyone, but I didn't think too much about it. It felt good to have some company, even if it was just a stray. The dog stayed with me for the rest of the evening, lying beside the fire, its head resting on its paws as if it had claimed that spot for itself. I finished eating and settled into my camp chair, watching the fire burn down to embers. The dog didn't leave, and I didn't mind. It was nice in a strange way, having some life around me in such an isolated place. But as the night wore on and the sky turned darker, things started to feel off. The wind had picked up, making the branches above creak and sway. The fire had died down to a low glow, and the shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer than usual. The dog started to act differently. At first, it just stood up, walking over to the edge of the clearing, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Then it started growling. A low, rumbling sound at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and more insistent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No more crickets, no more birds. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like something is watching you. The dog's growl grew deeper, its body tense, and it turned toward the woods, its eyes fixed on something unseen. I wasn't sure what it was. It could have been a deer, a raccoon, or some other animal that had caught its attention. But the growl didn't stop. It just kept on, low and steady, as if whatever was out there was too close for comfort. "Easy, boy," I muttered, trying to calm the dog, but it didn't listen. Instead, it started barking, a sharp, urgent bark that echoed through the trees, startling in the stillness. It stood rigid, staring into the darkness, its body trembling slightly, as if whatever it was seeing or sensing was something it didn't like. I wasn't sure what to do. The barking seemed to go on forever, with the dog occasionally snapping its head in different directions, as if it were tracking something that I couldn't see. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and turned it on, scanning the woods. The beam cut through the dark, but found nothing. The trees stood silent and still, their shadows long and stretching across the ground. "Hey, it's okay," I said, trying to soothe the dog, but it only barked louder, its tail held stiff and low. I got up from my chair, moving cautiously toward the dog, trying to get it to calm down. But as I stepped forward, I felt it. The air, which had been cool and breezy just a moment before, suddenly went still. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I felt a sharp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the kind of chill you get when something feels wrong, when you know you're not alone, even though you can't see anyone. I stopped dead in my tracks. The dog, still barking, suddenly turned its head toward me, and its eyes were wide, almost panicked. It backed away a few steps, still growling, its body taut. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the barking stopped. The dog fell silent, but its body was still trembling. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. I turned around, shining the flashlight across the clearing, but all I saw were the trees, the darkened woods beyond them, and the faint outline of my tent. Nothing else. The dog kept its eyes on me, but it didn't come any closer. It just sat there, watching its body low to the ground. I wasn't sure what to do. I was beginning to feel an overwhelming sense of unease, like I was being watched from all directions. The night felt heavier, somehow. The dog finally stood up, its tail tucked between its legs. It took a few slow steps backward, its eyes still locked on the trees. And then, without another sound, it turned and trotted off into the dark woods. The silence returned, almost suffocating in its intensity. I stood there for a long time, holding the flashlight in my hand, not sure whether I should follow the dog or stay put. I didn't hear it leave, no rustling in the underbrush, no sounds of it running off. It was as if it had disappeared into thin air. I waited for a few minutes, then decided that I wasn't going to chase after it. There was something in the woods, something that I couldn't quite place, and the last thing I wanted was to find out what it was. I went back to my fire, stoked it up again, and sat down, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. I stayed by the fire for hours, staring into the flames, listening to the crackling wood, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, just beyond the light of the fire. When I finally fell asleep in my tent, the night was quiet, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I slept fitfully, waking up every few hours, checking to make sure everything was still okay. The air outside was thick with stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. The next morning, I woke up to a cold, gray light filtering through the trees. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, stretching my legs and trying to shake off the grogginess. The air felt different now, a little colder, a little heavier than it had the night before. That's when I noticed the note. It was pinned to a tree behind my tent, almost directly behind where I had been sleeping. At first, I thought it was just some scrap of paper caught in the branches, but as I got closer, I saw that it was folded neatly with a single piece of twine wrapped around it, holding it in place. I pulled it down and opened it, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the morning light shining on the paper. The note was simple, handwritten in a hurried scrawl. "Thanks for watching him last night." I stood there, staring at the note for what felt like forever, trying to process what it meant. And then my heart skipped a beat. The dog. I hadn't seen it leave, hadn't heard it wander off, but someone had been there. Someone had been watching me, or perhaps watching the dog. I couldn't explain it, and the unease that had settled in my chest the night before came rushing back, a cold, tight knot in my stomach. I didn't know who had left the note or why. I didn't know who had been watching or what they were doing in the woods. But one thing was certain, I wasn't alone. And with that, I packed up my things quickly, not caring to stay another minute. The woods that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt like they were hiding something. Something I didn't want to find out. As I left the clearing and made my way back to the car, I glanced one last time at the note crumpled in my hand. There was no explanation, no answer to the question that kept looping in my mind. Who had been out there, and why they left that dog with me? I never did find out. It was late October when I decided to go on a solo backpacking trip through the Smoky Mountains. I'd done a few sections before, but this time I wanted to push a little deeper into the quieter parts of the park, away from the traffic, the tourists, and the weekend warriors. I had a week off work and packed light. Just the basics, a weatherproof bivvy, my stove, and enough food to last me 5 days. I brought my map and compass, and I made sure to leave a rough itinerary with my brother, just in case. The first day went smooth. The air was cool and dry, perfect for hiking. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the forest was painted in rust and gold. The trails were empty, just how I liked it. I stopped at a small clearing that night, near a creek. I set up, cooked some rice and lentils, and listened to the sound of water while the stars came out overhead. That night was peaceful. No bugs, no animals sniffing around. Just the cold, dry air and the steady murmur of the creek. On the second day, I hiked up through some denser forest. The trail narrowed and wound through switchbacks under bare trees. It was the kind of silence you only get deep in the woods. No planes, no cars, not even wind. Just the occasional call of a crow or the rustle of a squirrel. By mid-afternoon, I reached one of the old shelters that dotted the Smokies. Their basic 3 walls, a roof, a stone fire ring out front. No one else was around, and there hadn't been any fresh boot prints on the trail for hours. I checked the logbook in the shelter. Last entry was from 4 days ago, a pair of hikers heading southbound. Looked like I had it to myself. I was fine with that. I liked the solitude. I cooked dinner while the sun set. The temperature dropped fast. I wore my down jacket and beanie as I watched the last light fade through the trees. I didn't bother with a fire. It was more trouble than it was worth. I brushed my teeth, packed up my food, and walked out to hang it on the bare cables. After that, I crawled in my bivy sack in the back of the shelter, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in. The cold made everything quiet. Even the birds had stopped. I don't remember falling asleep. Just that stillness and the sharp edge of cold air on my face. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. No dreams, no sudden noise. Just that strange awareness that something had changed. I didn't move at first, just listened. My breath was visible in the dark. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, pacing footsteps outside the shelter. Back and forth across the leaves and frost. Not an animal. Too rhythmic, too heavy. 1, 2, 3, 4, then a pause. Then again, from left to right, just outside the open front of the shelter. I didn't move. I stayed zipped up in my bivvy, barely breathing. My heart was hammering. I told myself it might be a late arriving hiker, someone lost maybe, but deep down that didn't sit right. Nobody comes in that late, and not without a light. There was no flashlight beam, no sound of gear, no voice. Just those steps. Eventually, I forced myself to whisper, "Hello." The footsteps stopped instantly. Silence. I lay there for what felt like forever, heart pounding in my ears. Then I slowly unzipped my bivvy and sat up, every muscle tense. I looked out from the shelter. Nothing. Just a faint moonlight on frost-covered ground. No movement. No figure. No noise at all. I stayed like that for a long time, scanning the tree line, barely blinking. Eventually, I crawled back into the bivvy, not because I felt safe, but because I was freezing. I didn't sleep. I don't think I even closed my eyes again. Every sound felt loud. Every creak of the trees put me on edge. I stayed that way until the sky began to lighten. When it was finally bright enough to see clearly, I got out of my bivvy and stretched, bones stiff from the cold and tension. The air was bitter, and the ground was covered in a light frost that had settled during the night. I walked around the front of the shelter, checking the area, half expecting to find nothing. But I did find something. Footprints. Dozens of them. Bare feet. Human, from the look of them. Not boot prints, not shoes. Just bare, narrow feet pressed into the frost. Some were full prints, others partial, but they were clear enough to tell what they were. They circled the shelter. They crossed back and forth in front. They stopped just outside the threshold where I'd laid in the back corner. I stood there, staring. My breath came out in clouds. The tracks didn't lead away. They just faded into the crunch of leaves under the trees. I couldn't make sense of it. No one hikes barefoot out here in late October. You'd lose your toes, and these weren't old prints. They were fresh. Frost doesn't hold marks like that for long. I packed fast. I skipped breakfast, just stuffed my gear into my pack, yanked down the food bag without checking it, and got moving. I didn't even bother checking the shelter log again. I just wanted to be gone. I hiked fast that day. Too fast. I had to stop once to catch my breath and drink water. Every time I rounded a bend or came to a blind hill, I felt eyes on me. But there was never anyone there. The woods stayed silent. I made it to the next shelter around mid-afternoon. There were 3 other hikers already there, section hikers from Asheville, 2 guys and a woman, all in their 40s. I don't think I've ever been so relieved to see strangers. I didn't tell them what happened. Just said I'd had a rough night and left it at that. We ate together, traded some trail stories, and built a small fire. I forced myself to act normal. They didn't seem to notice anything off. That night, I still couldn't sleep. Every sound still made my heart jump. But there were other people around, and that helped a little. At one point, I got up and checked around the shelter with my headlamp. just to be sure. Nothing. No prints. No pacing. The next few days passed without incident. I saw more hikers, even a ranger. The trail felt normal again, but I never stopped thinking about those prints. When I got back to my car and finally had cell service, I texted my brother that I was safe and heading home. He asked how the trip went, and I told him it was quiet, peaceful. I didn't tell him about the shelter. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. But every once in a while, when I'm up in the woods alone, I think about those barefoot tracks in the frost, circling that shelter in the middle of the night. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't lost. They weren't looking for help. They knew exactly where I was. And they had no reason to be walking barefoot in that cold, that deep into the forest. Maybe it was someone living off-grid. Maybe it was someone not right in the head, wandering the woods for who knows how long. People go missing in the Smokies all the time. Sometimes they're found, sometimes they're not, and sometimes people find things that don't make any sense. All I know is if I ever come across another empty shelter that deep in the woods, I'll keep walking. We had planned the trip for a couple of months. It was one of those late summer weekends where everything seemed to line up. Weather looked perfect, no one had work, and everyone in the group was itching to get out of town for a bit. There were 6 of us, all in our late 20s, early 30s. We'd camped together plenty of times before, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4, sometimes more. This time it was a solid 6, me, Mike, his cousin Troy, Sarah, her girlfriend Alyssa, and our friend James. We picked a spot in the national forest about 3 hours out from the city. A place that Mike swore by. He'd camped there years ago with his brother and said it was remote, beautiful, and quiet. It was at the end of a long, barely maintained gravel road that curved through thick woods, deeper than most places we'd been to before. There was no cell service once we passed the last gas station. No nearby towns. No homes or farms. Just endless trees and the occasional sign pointing to a trailhead or forest access road. We got there late afternoon. Sunlight was bleeding sideways through the trees as we set up camp. 2 tents, a fire ring, and a small table for cooking. The site was open enough for comfort, but surrounded on all sides by tall, old pine trees. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and the air smelled like sap and moss. There was a trail that led down to a shallow creek, maybe a 5-minute walk from camp. The nearest official campsite was at least a mile back down the road, and we hadn't seen a single other car or person since we arrived. Dinner was simple: cans of chili, grilled sausages, some beers. We laughed, passed around a small bottle of bourbon, and watched the fire burn down low. Around midnight, people started drifting off. I was one of the last awake, sitting near the fire pit with Mike, both of us half dozing and watching embers float up into the dark trees. It was cool but not cold, and the fire kept the chill off our legs. We didn't talk much, just sat there letting the quiet take over. Eventually, he turned in 2, and I followed after tossing a few more pieces of wood into the fire to keep it going through the night. I slept light, like I usually do the first night in the woods. Every twig snap or gust of wind makes me lift my head a little, but I was used to that. The tent was still, the forest outside calm. I don't know what time it was when I first heard it, but it was late. I checked my watch later and saw it was a little after 2 a.m. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was faint, too faint to make out clearly. Then I heard it again, more distinct this time. "Help, somebody, please help me." It sounded like a little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The voice was thin, like it was being carried by the wind, but it was close enough that I knew it wasn't an echo or some trick of the trees. It was coming from the woods, maybe 20 or 30 yards out from the edge of our campsite. I sat up fast, heart already starting to thump. For a second, I stayed frozen, thinking maybe one of the others was playing a trick. But we hadn't brought any kids. None of us even had kids. And nobody else was out here, we'd been sure of that. Then the voice came again, this time a little louder, a little more desperate. "Help me, please. I'm lost." I reached for my headlamp and turned it on. The tent lit up instantly. I unzipped it slowly and stepped out, listening hard. The woods were still. Too still. No wind now. No bugs. No night sounds. Just quiet and that soft, panicked voice again, just out of sight. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I saw other beams of light flicking on from the tents around me. Alyssa came out of hers, looking confused and uneasy. Mike followed a second later, then Sarah and James. We didn't say a word, just stood there in the cold night air, our breath visible, staring at the dark line of trees at the edge of camp. The voice came again, this time from the left. Same tone, same words. Please help. I can't find my way. Something about it was off. The way the voice repeated itself. Like it wasn't a full conversation or real pleading. More like a broken record. Like it only knew how to say a few things. Always the same cadence. The same pause between each sentence. I could feel my skin crawling as I stared into the woods. James stepped closer to the edge of camp, his flashlight beam cutting across the trunks. "Don't go out there," I said. My voice came out low and sharp. He looked back at me, and I could see the uncertainty in his face. The voice called again. "Help me." We stayed like that for maybe a minute, listening. The voice would move, first to our left, then back behind us, then to the right, like it was circling us just out of sight, never getting closer, never fully retreating. We finally started calling out, not to it but to each other, trying to make sense of it. We double-checked that none of us had phones that picked up service. We didn't. We were cut off. I suggested we try the emergency radio we kept in the gear bag, one of those hand crank models that could get a signal even when phones couldn't. We pulled it out, got it going, and tuned into the local ranger channel. To our surprise, someone responded almost immediately. It was a woman's voice. Calm, professional, but direct. We explained what we were hearing. We didn't use flowery language, just told her there was a voice in the woods, a child calling for help. And we were certain no kids were with us. There was a long pause on the radio before she came back. "You need to stay in your campsite," she said. "Do not go into the woods. Stay together. If you feel unsafe, pack up and come out of first light. But do not follow any voices." Understood. That was it. No questions about the location, no request for a callback number. Just flat instructions. Her tone wasn't panicked, but it had the kind of weight that made your spine straighten up. We asked if any kids were missing in the area. She said no. Then she added something I didn't expect. "You're not the first ones to report this. We get calls like that from time to time in that sector. Best thing you can do is ignore it. Don't follow it. Stay put." After that, we didn't talk much. Everyone sat close to the fire, wide-eyed, listening. The voice kept up for another 10 minutes or so, but it never changed. Always the same few lines, always the same tone. Eventually it faded. We didn't know if it had stopped or just gotten too far away to hear. No one slept the rest of the night. We stayed around the fire, waiting for daylight. No one moved more than a few steps from the group. Every little crack of a branch or rustle in the trees made us whip our heads around. But nothing else happened. Just that cold, dark silence. The kind that makes you feel like you're being watched, even if you can't prove it. Morning came slow. As soon as the sun started coming up, we packed everything as fast as we could. Coffee was skipped. Breakfast too. We shoved gear into bags without caring if it fit right. The fire was smothered, the tents crammed into trunks half-zipped. On the drive out, we barely spoke. It wasn't until we hit pavement again and got a few bars of service that the weight lifted slightly. I checked the local ranger station's website when we stopped for gas. No missing persons reports. No news of a lost child. Nothing. A few days later, I dug deeper. Looked at forums, local threads, backwoods hiking groups. Turns out there were stories from that area going back years. All the same, people camping out, hearing a child in the woods, always around 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, always saying the same few things. Some people had followed it. Those were the stories that stuck with me. One guy said he went in 30 yards and suddenly felt like he didn't know where he was. He swore he'd only gone a short way from his tent, but when he turned back, he couldn't see the campfire or hear his friends calling for him. He wandered for an hour before finding his way back. Another post mentioned that someone chased the voice thinking it might be a real kid. They ended up slipping on some wet rocks near the creek and breaking their leg. Had to be airlifted out. No kid was ever found. I don't know what's out there. I don't pretend to. I don't jump to ghosts or skinwalkers or anything like that. But something strange happens in those woods. Something that doesn't make sense, and I know what I heard wasn't a bird or a fox or the wind. It was a child's voice, repeating the same lines over and over, try to pull someone out past the tree line. We haven't been back to that spot since. And when we camp now, we don't go anywhere without cell service. We stay in campgrounds with other people nearby, and we always bring that radio. I think the worst part isn't even the voice. It's how it felt in the moment. Like whatever it was knew exactly what to say to make you listen. Knew how to sound helpless, how to sound small and scared. It makes you question your instincts, because what kind of person ignores a kid crying for help? That's what sticks with you. That sick feeling of being torn between helping and staying alive. That, and the silence after it stopped. The forest felt wrong in those hours between the voice and sunrise. Like it was waiting for one of us to make the wrong move. We didn't, but I wonder how many people have. And I wonder what happens when they do. I was out in Washington, solo camping for the weekend. I picked a spot I found online, not in any of the popular areas. It was one of those Forest Service roads that branches off and leads you up into the middle of nowhere. I'd driven about an hour past El Signal and another 40 minutes down a gravel road lined with pine and fir. Potholes everywhere, barely enough space for my truck to squeeze through. No signs, no campsites, just pull-offs and old logging spurs. That's how I like it. Quiet, no other people, just trees and dirt and sky. I pulled into a clearing around 4 in the afternoon. Enough room to turn the truck around if I needed to, fairly level, and the tree cover wasn't too heavy overhead. You could see a strip of sky above, which I always liked. Makes me feel less boxed in. I set up my tent about 15 feet from a fire pit someone had made years ago with a ring of blackened rocks. The grass and moss were soft, and the air smelled clean. Cold Creek water wasn't far off either. I could hear it trickling faintly downhill to the east. I remember thinking this was perfect. Everything about it felt right. I cooked dinner on my little backpacking stove, just a packet of dehydrated chili mac and a cup of instant coffee. I didn't bother with a fire. I rarely do unless I need one. Too much hassle sometimes. After eating, I packed up all my trash and stashed the food in the truck just to be safe. Black bears are common, and though I hadn't seen any signs, no scat, no claw marks, I wasn't about to leave food near my tent. It got dark fast. The sun disappeared behind the hills around 7, and by 8 it was pitch black except for the stars. That deep woods kind of dark where your eyes never fully adjust. I sat outside the tent a while listening. You could tell a lot about a place by how it sounds at night. This spot was quiet, just wind in the branches and the occasional pop of some small animal in the brush. No owls, which I thought was odd, but not unsettling. Just a detail I noticed. By 10, I was zipped in my sleeping bag, headlamp off. I lay there a long time before I drifted off. You sleep light when you're alone in the woods. Every snap of a twig brings you halfway back to waking. I don't remember dreaming. It was one of those sleeps where your brain stays just under the surface, alert but not fully conscious. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. I didn't check my watch. It was still dark, that much I know. Not early morning dark. Night dark. I opened my eyes to silence. No wind, no bugs, no creek. Just this dead stillness. That's what struck me first. Everything had gone quiet. Then I heard it. A soft scratching. Light. Careful. It came from my left side, just outside the tent wall. I froze. My breath caught. It didn't sound like an animal sniffing or pawing. It wasn't the quick, erratic kind of noise you get from a raccoon or a squirrel. This was slow, intentional. Scratch, pause, scratch, like fingernails over the nylon. Moving, circling. I didn't move, just listened. My eyes were wide in the dark, and I tried to slow my breathing so I could hear better. The scratching moved to the foot of the tent, still steady, then around to the right side. It stopped for a second, then started again. Always the same rhythm, always dragging just enough to push through the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. I reached slowly for my knife. It was right beside my sleeping bag. Not that I thought I'd need it, but it made me feel less helpless. My hand closed around the handle, and I lay there, arms stiff at my side, listening. The scratching made one more lap, as if whoever or whatever was out there tracing the whole perimeter. When it reached the front where the zipper was, it stopped. I waited. Nothing. I finally worked up the nerve to yell. Just a loud, sharp shout. Not words, just noise, trying to startle whatever was out there. The second I did, the scratching stopped. Completely. Like flipping a switch. I waited. Nothing happened. No footsteps running off. No sound of anything crashing through the woods. Just dead silence again. Then the wind picked up, faint and cold, and rustled the top of the tent. I lay there the rest of the night, knife in hand, staring at the ceiling of my tent. I didn't sleep another second. Every time the wind moved, I flinched. Every time the trees creaked, I thought it was footsteps, but nothing else happened. Eventually the sky started to lighten, and I could make out the shapes of the branches above through the mesh. As soon as I could see well enough, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest looked normal, same as before. Birds were back, squirrels in the brush. That eerie stillness from the night before was gone like it had never been there. I walked a slow circle around my tent, checking the ground. Nothing. No prints. No tracks. No disturbed leaves. The ground was soft from recent rain, so if something heavy had walked by, I should have seen it. But there wasn't a thing. Then I looked at the tent. All around the base of a nylon, in a near-perfect ring, were scratches. Thin, shallow, but long. Not claw marks. Not random. These looked like someone had dragged their fingernails along the fabric. Same rhythm I'd heard. Scratch, pause, scratch. Some overlapped where the thing had passed by the same area more than once. They weren't deep enough to rip the tent, but they were there. Clear as day. I stood there a long time, just staring. I didn't want to touch them. Didn't want to get too close. I felt exposed, like someone might still be watching from the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling. I packed everything as fast as I could. Tent down, gear thrown into the bed of the truck. No breakfast. I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole time. Driving out, I realized I hadn't passed another vehicle the entire time I was out there. No tire tracks except my own. No trash. No old campsites that looked recently used. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there wasn't camping. They hadn't come in a car, and they hadn't left any trace but those scratches. It bothered me for a long time after. I kept the tent for a few months. I didn't want to, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. I'd look at it sometimes, unfold it halfway, just to check if the scratches were still there. They always were. Eventually, I gave it away to a guy I knew who collected gear. I didn't tell him about what happened. I still camp alone. I haven't stopped, but I haven't been back to Washington since. That experience changed something for me. Not enough to quit the woods, but enough to make me think twice about where I set up camp. Enough to make me sleep lighter than ever. And I don't yell out anymore when I hear something. If I hear that kind of scratching again, I won't make a sound. I'll just lie there and listen. Because whatever was out there that night wasn't an animal. And it wasn't a ghost. It was real. It was human. And I think it wanted me to come out. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I was in my tent, nestled in a remote spot in Idaho, miles away from any sign of civilization. I've been hiking all day, covering as much ground as I could before dark, because that's how you get the best sleep in a tent, before the silence of night sets in too deep, before the things that lurk in the dark start making their moves. The air was cold and crisp, a reminder that I was deep in the wild, where there were no street lights, no sounds of distant traffic, just the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of something large in the brush nearby. The spot I'd chosen was far off any beaten path, so far that it would take hours of hiking for anyone to stumble upon it by accident. The terrain was rough, rocky, with jagged outcrops that made it near impossible for cars to get through. There weren't any established campground around either, just forest, wilderness, and the kind of isolation you only dream about when you want to get away from the noise of the world. I had been out here before, but this time something felt different. The wind wasn't as brisk as usual, and there was a heavy stillness in the air. My dog, who usually loves to roam around the camp, had stayed close to the tent all night, his fur bristling slightly. I chalked it up to nothing, wildlife, maybe, or just the unfamiliarity of the area. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach kept gnawing at me, and I couldn't shake it. The light of the moon barely cut through the thick trees, leaving the area in a kind of dark gray haze. I lay still in my sleeping bag, trying to sleep, But my mind kept replaying the sounds I'd heard earlier. A crack of a branch breaking, the scurry of something large just beyond my sight. The woods had always felt alive to me, but tonight something felt off, and I couldn't put my finger on it. The kind of off where your skin prickles and you start scanning the dark corners of the tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that doesn't belong. That's what happened. The headlights hit first, bright, cutting through the trees like a knife, the beams illuminating the underbrush before finding their way to me. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one could have found this place, not without knowing exactly where to look. I froze, staring out the mesh of my tent, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle. A white van. It pulled up, and the light from its headlights bathed the area around it. But it didn't move. It just sat there about 50 yards away, idling, its engine running so quietly it almost seemed like it was a part of the forest itself. I didn't hear a single tire crack against the dirt, no gravel crunching beneath it, nothing to indicate that this van had arrived in any real way. It was just there. The headlights shined, unwavering, unmoving, directly at me. I could hear my heartbeat, heavy in my chest, a thudding echo in the cold silence. I instinctively reached for my gun. It was tucked safely beside me, my fingers wrapping around the cold metal like I had done so many times before, just as a precaution. My breath was shallow. I didn't know who was out there or what they were doing, but I knew enough to know that I wasn't going to let whatever this was catch me off guard. Time stretched on, and the van didn't move. It just sat there, engines purring like some kind of sick joke. I kept my eyes on it through the small mesh window in my tent, half hoping the darkness would swallow it up, make it disappear. But it didn't. The van was solid. The headlights were so bright, I had to shield my eyes from them, but no one got out. No door opened, no footsteps in the dirt, nothing. It was like the van had been dropped from the sky, fully formed and waiting. The longer I watched it, the more unnerving it became. Who would be out here at this hour? Who would drive all the way down a rocky, barely passable trail to park 50 yards from someone's tent and not even get out? The isolation here was complete. The nearest road was miles away, and the trail I had come down to reach this spot wasn't something you just stumbled upon. I'd been alone for hours, so what was this van doing here in the dead of night? I stayed in my tent, the gun ready, my hand steady despite the anxiety creeping into my limbs. I knew I shouldn't make any noise, shouldn't draw attention to myself. There were no other campsites for miles, no other vehicles parked anywhere nearby. It was just me in the woods and this van. I couldn't make sense of it, and the more I tried, the more I felt a strange unease crawling up my spine. The van sat there for hours. I don't know exactly how long. Time blurred. I watched the headlights, flickering slightly in the distance, but no other movement. No other sign of life. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustle in the trees around me, but I couldn't tell if it was the wind, animals, or something else entirely. My dog, still huddled next to me, was silent. He hadn't barked, hadn't moved. It was like he was sensing something I couldn't see. At one point, I had to fight the urge to go outside and confront whatever was going on. My mind screamed at me to take action, to be proactive, but something in my gut told me to wait. I knew, deep down, that making a rash move might be a mistake. There was something methodical about the way the van sat there, the way it did nothing, but in that stillness, I felt something off. The first light of dawn broke the heavy darkness. The air was colder, the sky turning a pale shade of blue as the day tried to make its way through. That's what happened. The van blinked its headlights, once, twice, like a signal, and then it started moving slowly. Not in the way a normal vehicle would drive, no. It didn't rev its engine, didn't make any sounds of tires on the trail. It just moved, gradually fading into the distance, without leaving a trace. No sound, no rumble of an engine or the screech of brakes. It just vanished into the morning. My mind reeled, tried to process it. I waited in silence, unsure what to make of it. When the van was finally gone, I crept out of the tent, gun still in hand, heart racing. I stepped out into the cold morning, squinting against the first light of day. There was no sign of the van, no tracks, no tire marks in the dirt. The ground around me was untouched, as if nothing had been there at all. I checked the surrounding area, making my way cautiously through the forest. Nothing, not a thing to indicate that anyone had been there. I even walked down the trail where the van had appeared to come from, thinking maybe I could find something, anything that would explain it. But there was nothing. I couldn't make sense of it. No other vehicles passed by. No other campers were in the area. The van had come from nowhere and disappeared into nothing. There wasn't a single sign that anyone had been out there. No tracks, no disturbances in the forest floor, nothing. The trail was just as untouched as it had been when I first arrived. I spent the rest of the day in silence, trying to shake off the unnerving feeling that still clung to me. The woods felt strangely quiet, the wind not even whispering through the trees. It was as if the whole world had stopped to watch that van, to make sure it was gone. But whatever it wasn't coming back. I was sure of that. The rest of my trip passed uneventfully, but that night, when I lay in my sleeping bag, I kept expecting to hear the soft hum of a van's engine in the distance, the flicker of headlights cutting through the trees. But there was nothing, just the sound of the forest, just the silence. In the end, I had to accept that I would never know what that van was or who had been behind the wheel. But the fear that lingered in the pit of my stomach told me one thing. I wasn't the only one out there in those woods. And some things, some people, might not want to be found. I was camping alone in a remote canyon. It wasn't the first time I'd been out there. I'd spent several nights hiking through similar terrain, rough but beautiful. But this night felt different. Maybe it was the wind, the way it howled through the canyon walls, or maybe it was just the eerie silence that filled the air once the sun dropped behind the ridge lines. The only sound I had was the crackle of the campfire and the distant rattle of a few rocks shifting in the wind. It had been a long day of hiking, and by the time I got to the spot I decided to camp, it was already getting dark. The canyon was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the tiniest sound echo. I'd gotten used to being alone in the wilderness, but something about this place felt off. Still, I pushed the thought aside as I unpacked my gear and set up camp. The firewood I collected was dry enough to catch quickly, and soon I had a decent blaze going. I made a simple meal and sat close to the fire, the flames crackling in the otherwise still night. As the fire started to burn down, I sat back and watched the smoke curl up into the night. I stretched my legs out, feeling the heat on my face, and for a moment, I thought about the world beyond the canyon. Life back in the town, the job, the routine, everything that didn't involve this kind of isolation. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost drowned out by the wind, but clear enough for me to catch. Whistling. Not a soft breeze, not the sound of animals, but a clear, deliberate whistle, short and sweet. I thought it was just the wind at first, but it wasn't. It was too structured, too regular. And then I realized it was getting closer. I froze, my body tensing, and my eyes darted around the darkness. The fire didn't do much to cut through the night out here. The canyon walls seemed to fold in on me, making everything feel like it was closing in. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, convincing myself it was just a person hiking through, maybe a local coming down the trail after dark. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The same short tune, the same odd rhythm. It sounded like someone was deliberately whistling, and it wasn't stopping. It felt like it was moving closer to me, but I couldn't see anyone. The wind didn't carry any smells, no scent of another person. I glanced over my shoulder into the darkness, but all I saw were shadows, the vague outlines of rocks and cliffs, nothing that could explain the sound. I grabbed my knife. It was a sharp, well-worn tool, one I carried for safety, nothing more than a habit after all the solo trips I'd taken. The handle felt solid in my hand, reassuring in a way. But the whistling kept coming. It was still short, still the same odd pattern, and it didn't falter. The kind of whistle a person might make if they were walking toward you, unaware or maybe not caring that you were out there. The closer it got, the more uneasy I became. My instincts were on high alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there knew exactly where I was. That they weren't just passing through, like I'd hoped, but were deliberately making their way toward me. My breath came in shallow bursts. and I found myself looking around for any sign of movement, any shadow in the dark that might have been a person. The whistling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the only sound was my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, holding my breath, the knife tight in my hand. Seconds felt like hours as I scanned the night, every rustle of the wind or snap of a twig making me jump. I called out, not sure why, but hoping to make some kind of contact to break the silence. "Hey," I shouted. "Who's there?" Nothing. No answer, no movement, not even a whisper of the wind. The canyon was eerily still. I sat there, the fire now a mere glow, the embers faint against the overwhelming blackness. I could feel my pulse in my ears, ringing louder than the wind. I kept the knife in my lap, my fingers gripping it tightly. For a long time, nothing happened. No more whistling, no movement. The only sounds I could hear were my breath and the crackling of the fire. But I couldn't relax. I stayed alert, my senses heightened, ears straining for any new noise. The night dragged on. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or some animal, maybe a coyote or something else. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept waiting for the sound to come back, but it didn't. Slowly, the fire burned down, and I couldn't bring myself to add more wood. It was as if I was waiting for something. Someone. Hours passed before I finally felt like I could let my guard down just a little. My eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, but I stayed alert, waiting for the dawn. The temperature dropped, and the cold seeped in my bones, but I didn't dare leave the fire. I told myself over and over that I was just imagining things. That whistling wasn't real, that it was just the wind, or maybe an animal I hadn't heard of before. Still, I couldn't shake the gnawing fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. When a first hint of dawn appeared, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. The dark sky slowly began to lighten, and the shadows of the canyon walls started to fade. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But then, just as the first rays of sunlight touched the rocky walls, the whistling started again. And this time, it came from the opposite direction. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp, rhythmic whistle, the same short tune, echoing through the canyon from the other side. I glanced toward the sound, feeling a chill run down my spine. How could it be coming from the opposite direction now? I hadn't heard anyone else approach, no sign of any movement from the night before. But there was again that same whistle, cutting through the stillness of the morning. It was closer now, even more deliberate, and it sent a wave of dread crawling through me. The thought of someone moving around me, unseen, without any trace, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled to pack up my gear. I didn't care if it was light now. I didn't care if the danger I felt was irrational. I wasn't sticking around to find out. The sound of the whistle seemed to get closer, just as it had the night before, and I wasn't about to wait around to see what it meant. I grabbed my things as quickly as I could, packing up the tent, shoving the gear into my pack, and keeping my eyes on the horizon. The whistling didn't stop. It just kept going, now more urgent, as if something or someone was getting closer. The last thing I wanted was to stick around to find out what that meant. I didn't even bother with the fire. I left the embers smoldering and the ashes in the pit, grabbed my pack, and started making my way out of the canyon. Every step I took felt like I was running, but I knew I couldn't run forever. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something coming after me, but I never saw a soul. The whistling didn't stop, though. It kept going until it was barely audible. When I finally reached the edge of the canyon, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. The sun was fully up now, and the light had burned away most of the darkness. But my heart was still racing. The sound of the whistle was gone. I didn't hear it anymore. I wasn't sure if it had ever really been there in the first place, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. I didn't stop hiking until I reached the nearest town. The whole way, I kept expecting to hear that whistle again, but it didn't come. I don't know what happened out there. Maybe I was just spooked, or maybe there was something I couldn't explain. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to find out. That canyon is not a place I'll ever go back to, no matter how much I love the outdoors. Some places have a way of getting under your skin, and some experiences are best left unexplored. When I finally made it back to the safety of the town, I took a deep breath and didn't look back. That's the thing about the wilderness. It can be peaceful, but it can also be terrifying. You never really know what's out there. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky when we set up camp. We've been hiking through the forest for hours, the cool mountain air fresh against our skin. My friend Jess and I had been planning this trip for a while. 2 days of hiking, camping, and escaping the grind of everyday life. We picked this spot because it was remote, far from the nearest trailhead, and not a lot of people made the trek up here. We were alone, just how we liked it. By the time we got everything set up, our tent staked in place, the fire pit dug out, and our gear scattered neatly around us, there was no one else around. The only sound was the wind rustling the branches above us, the occasional bird call, and the soft crunch of the forest floor beneath our boots. It felt peaceful, almost like we had the whole forest to ourselves. After a long day of hiking, we were both ready for a break. Jess had a book out and was reading by the firelight, while I leaned back against a tree, staring up at the darkening sky. The last rays of the sun were gone, leaving only the faintest glow on the horizon. The woods around us were already quieting down for the night, the birds and insects slowing to a hush. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was Jess standing up, maybe stretching or going to grab something from the tent. But when I looked closer, I saw the figure moving between the trees, just outside the camp, maybe 50 yards or so. It was too dark to make out details clearly, but it was definitely a person walking through the trees at a steady pace. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone else was out here. This part of the forest was hard to access unless you knew exactly where you were going, and we hadn't seen anyone else all day. But there the figure was, moving swiftly but without any rush, just walking through the trees like they knew exactly where they were going. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. It was hard to tell, but it looked like the person had on the same dark jacket and cargo pants as Jess. And they had the same backpack slung over their shoulder, exactly like hers. The same build too. It was impossible, but for a second I thought maybe she'd gotten up and gone off somewhere. Jess! I called out, my voice quiet but clear. The figure stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, the figure faced me. I could see a bit more clearly now, the faint outline of their face illuminated by the dying light of the fire. The shape of their face was unmistakable. The same features as Jess, the same build, the same hair tied up in a messy bun. But something was off. The smile that spread across the figure's face wasn't a normal one. It was wide, way too wide, stretching unnaturally across their face like it was forced into place. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized something was very wrong. The figure's eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, didn't look like Jess's at all. They were too dark, too empty, and they didn't reflect the same warmth I was used to. There was something off about them. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. Without saying a word, the figure's smile seemed to grow even wider, and then, without hesitation, they turned and sprinted into the trees. The movement was unnatural, fast, and almost fluid, like something wasn't quite right with how they moved. I stood there, completely still, watching as the figure disappeared into the darkness of the woods. The sound of their feet pounding against the forest floor echoed in my ears, and then silence. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. My body was frozen, not from fear, but from a deep sense of confusion and disbelief. I stared into the darkness where the figure had disappeared, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. But there was no explanation, not one that made sense. Jess had been right behind me when I saw the figure. How could it be her? She hadn't moved at all, and I was sure I hadn't seen her walk off. And yet there it was, a figure that looked exactly like her, walking through the woods as if they belonged there. I turned back toward the campfire, my heart pounding in my chest. Jess was still sitting where I'd left her, completely unaware of what had just happened. She looked up at me with a raised eyebrow. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice calm and unbothered. "Yeah," I replied, though I didn't feel okay. My throat was dry, my mouth too tight to say much more. I think I just saw someone. Someone? Like who? I don't know. I swallowed hard. Someone was walking through the woods just now, looked like you. Same clothes, same backpack. But you were right here the whole time. I could hear the disbelief in my voice. Jess didn't look alarmed, just a little confused. What do you mean, same backpack? Are you sure it was me? I don't know, I said, shaking my head. I saw them, Jess. I called out to them, and they turned and smiled at me. It wasn't you. It was wrong. It was just wrong. My voice wavered, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. She looked at me for a moment, then shrugged. You're probably just tired, and your eyes are playing tricks on you. It's been a long day. Maybe you just saw something that wasn't there. I didn't want to believe it, but part of me knew she was right. Maybe I just seen things out of the corner of my eye, the way you do when you're too tired. Maybe it was just the fading light and the shadows playing tricks on me. But still, something didn't sit right. Something about the way the figure had smiled, the way they had run off into the woods. It felt too real, too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. We sat there in silence for a while after that. Jess went back to her book, and I kept glancing over at the trees, still half expecting to see the figure reappear. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the forest at night. As the night wore on, I couldn't relax. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the brush made my skin crawl. I kept thinking about the smile, the wide, unnatural smile that stretched too far across the figure's face. It was stuck in my head like an image I couldn't shake. I kept looking into the dark trees, half expecting the figure to emerge again. Jess, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper, I think we should head back. Now. She looked at me, a little confused. What? It's late. We're not going anywhere. No, seriously. Something isn't right. I don't feel good about staying here tonight. She hesitated for a moment, and I could tell she wasn't sure what to make of my sudden shift in mood. But then she nodded, and we packed up quickly, not bothering with much care. I couldn't stay here any longer. The feeling of unease was too strong, and I had to leave. We weren't safe here. We grabbed our things, packed up the tent, and made our way down the trail. I didn't look back. It wasn't until we made it to the trailhead that I felt the weight in my chest finally ease. The night air felt less oppressive, and the distant lights from the town felt like a promise of safety. Jess had been quiet the entire time, but I could feel her watching me from behind. When we finally reached the parking lot, I turned to her and let out a long breath. I'm sorry for freaking out, but I swear to you I saw something. It wasn't you out there in the woods. It wasn't normal. She stared at me for a long time before saying anything. I know, she said softly. I've been thinking the same thing. I heard something out there too. Something running. I froze. You heard it too? She nodded, but I didn't want to say anything. Not until we were out of there. I thought I was just being paranoid. I didn't know what to say. I didn't have any answers, but at least I wasn't alone in feeling the fear. We both knew that whatever we had seen out there wasn't normal. We were lucky to have gotten out of there in one piece. After we drove away, I never went back to that place. The woods had been too quiet, too still. Something was out there, and it didn't want us to stay. And sometimes, when the wind rustles the trees just right, I can almost hear it again, the sound of footsteps running in the dark. I had been out in that part of the woods for 2 nights already, and everything had been fine until the last morning. It was one of those old, forgotten corners of the forest where the trees grow thick and tall, and the ground is soft with needles and moss. I'd parked off an old logging road that looked like no one had driven it in years. Just 2 faint ruts pushing through the brush, half swallowed by the undergrowth. It was perfect, quiet, remote, exactly what I needed. I was out there just to get away, breathe a little, and sleep under the open sky. No cell service, no people, no noise. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I'd be, just that I'd be gone for a few days. That first night, I set up my little 2-person tent a good 50 yards from the road, deep enough in that I couldn't see or hear anything but the forest. The only sound was the wind moving through the canopy, an occasional creak of an old tree settling, and the chatter of insects when it got dark. I gathered wood, built a small fire, and ate canned chili straight from the pot. It was cold, but not bad. I brought a thick sleeping bag and an extra layer. It wasn't my first time camping solo. The second day passed slow and peaceful. I went for a long walk deeper into the woods, following a narrow game trail along a dry creek bed. I didn't see anyone or anything strange, just deer prints and the usual signs of squirrels and birds. I didn't even hear any coyotes that night, which was a little unusual, but I didn't think much of it. The forest just felt quiet. Still, that night I was too tired to build a fire, so I boiled water for some instant noodles on my small camp stove and sat in the dark with my headlamp, eating in silence. I thought I heard something big moving far off in the trees once, but it was just for a second and then gone. Probably a deer. The wind had picked up a little. I zipped the tent shut, climbed into my bag, and eventually drifted off. It was maybe 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning when I woke up. Not quite dawn, but the kind of light that makes the trees look like black cutouts against a deep blue sky. I was cold. My breath fogged the air inside the tent. Something had pulled me out of sleep, maybe a sound, maybe just the way the wind had gone still. I lay there listening for a minute, trying to hear anything unusual. Nothing, just silence. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. My boots were cold and a little damp. The forest looked different in that early light. Not just darker, stranger. The trees seemed taller somehow, more closed in, like they were pressing in on the little clearing where I had pitched the tent. I stretched, cracked my back, then went to take a leak behind a thick fir tree, maybe 20 feet away. That's when I saw the first one. It was hanging from a low branch, maybe chest height. A bit of bone, some kind of vertebra, I think, with a patch of dirty fur tied to it with thin, rusty wire. It swayed gently even though there wasn't any wind. I stared at it for a second, confused, then looked around and spotted another one, farther off to the left. And then another. They were all around me. Little objects hanging from branches. Some had bits of jawbone. Others looked like they were made from twisted sticks with scraps of fur or feather stuck into them. A few had more of that wire, coiled and bent into shapes that didn't really look like anything, just tangled messes. Some were low, easy to spot. Others were higher up, like someone had climbed the trees to hang them. I hadn't seen a single one the night before. I would have noticed. I walked this whole area when I was collecting firewood. They hadn't been there yesterday. I didn't feel scared right away. Not exactly. More like I couldn't think straight. My brain was trying to catch up to what I was seeing, trying to find some logical reason for it. Maybe kids had come through during the night and hung them as some kind of prank. But I hadn't heard a sound. Not a single footstep. Not a whisper of movement. And who would do that way out here? There weren't even tire tracks on that old road. Nothing fresh, anyway. Then the fear came in like a wave. My chest tightened, and the skin on the back of my neck felt cold and tight. I could feel my heart start to hammer in my ribs. I packed up fast. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I tore down the tent and stuffed it into my bag without folding it, jammed everything else in on top. Sleeping bag, stove, water bottle, gear, all of it. My hands were shaking, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there watching me. But there was no one. Just those hanging things swaying gently, as if they were breathing. I threw my pack on and got moving. The path back to the road was short, maybe a 5-minute walk. But every step felt longer, like the forest was stretching out. I didn't run, but I didn't walk slow either. My eyes scanned the trees constantly, and I kept my pocket knife gripped in my hand, even though I knew it wouldn't help much if someone wanted to do real harm. The air felt wrong, like it was too still. No bird song, no rustling branches. Nothing. When I got back to the road, I could see my car just down the hill, parked where the tree line opened up into a narrow gravel pull-off. I started down the slope fast, slipping once and catching myself on a root. I didn't stop moving until I was right next to the car. That's when I saw him. He was walking up the road, coming from the opposite direction. I didn't hear him approach. He just appeared. 1 second the road was empty. The next he was there, a man in dark clothes, walking slow and steady, like he wasn't in a hurry at all. He looked like he might have been in his 50s, maybe older. Gray in his beard, deep lines in his face. He wasn't carrying a pack or even a water bottle, just walking with his arms relaxed at his sides. His eyes were on me, and when we passed each other, me heading to the car, him heading into the trees, he smiled. That smile was wide, too wide. It didn't reach his eyes, and he never blinked. Not once. I didn't say a word. I didn't nod or wave. Just got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I pulled out fast, gravel spitting behind me, and didn't look in the rearview mirror for the first mile. When I finally did, the road was empty. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the first gas station, and I didn't stop until I was surrounded by pavement, traffic, and people. I filled up the tank, then sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes just watching people go about their day. Tried to calm down, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just some weird coincidence. Maybe the man lived out there. Maybe he made those things and hung them up for some strange personal reason. Maybe he was harmless. But that smile, I've never seen a smile like that before. And those objects, I can't explain how they got there so fast. How I didn't hear anything. How whoever made them moved through the forest without a sound. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. What would I even say? There's nothing illegal about bones and wire and fur in the trees. There's nothing criminal about a man walking in the woods. No one hurt me. Nothing technically happened. But that's the part that stays with me. The fact that I left before something did. The way my gut screamed at me to get out. The way the forest had gone still. The way I was being watched. No doubt in my mind about that. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. Just a man. A man who'd been out there for a long time, maybe. Long enough to know how to move through the woods without making a sound. Long enough to know where people go to be alone. Long enough to know what to hang from trees to make sure they never come back. I haven't, and I won't. I had been driving through Utah for a few days, taking my time between small towns and rough dirt roads that cut through open land. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't really have a plan either, just a few supplies in the back of my truck, a tent, some food, water, and a couple maps with places circled from things I'd read online or heard about from others on the road. BLM land had always been my go-to when I didn't want to deal with crowded campgrounds or fees. It felt better being out where no one else was around, where I could park the truck, walk a bit, pitch my tent, and be completely alone. That's what I wanted this time, too. Just a quiet night under the stars, far from the road, far from people. It was late afternoon when I pulled off a narrow dirt road. Nothing marked, nothing maintained. Just a rough track that disappeared behind a rise. I drove slow to keep from bottoming out. The land out here was dry and open, mostly scrub and sandstone, with red dust that clung to the tires and crept through the windows. I found a decent spot near a low rock formation. It wasn't much, just a natural rise that broke the flatness of the land, but it blocked the wind some and gave me a bit of shade to work in. I set up the tent quickly, just a small 2-person one I'd been using for years. No campfire this time. The wind had been strong lately, and I didn't want to take any chances. I had cold food, jerky, a couple cans of chili if I really needed something hot. I wasn't planning to stay more than a night anyway. After setting up, I walked around a bit to stretch my legs. The land sloped slightly downward past my camp and flattened out again, maybe 100 yards out. That's when I saw it. A small pile of rocks, built by hand, not natural. It looked old, sun-bleached and wind-blown, just a few feet wide and maybe 2 feet tall. Right in the center was a rusted metal cross, about the size of my forearm. Someone had hammered it into the rocks a long time ago. It had a rough look to it, like something handmade from scrap metal. No decoration, no fancy edges, just a cross. And welded into the horizontal bar were 2 letters, EJ. No dates, no words, just those initials. I stood there for a while, hands on my hips, feeling the wind whip around me. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but not in a supernatural way. Just real, human. Whoever EJ was, this was all that marked them now. No flowers, no photos, no notes. Just rocks and rust. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. I turned around and walked back to camp, telling myself it was probably a memorial. Maybe someone's favorite spot. Maybe someone died here, and this was all their friends or family could do. That happens sometimes. People go hiking or driving or camping and don't come back. Out here, it's easy to disappear. The sun dropped fast after that. Utah skies always did that. bright and blinding one moment, then a sudden coolness and long shadows creeping in. I sat near the tent for a while, watching the stars come out, drinking from my water bottle, chewing on some trail mix. I didn't have a fire, so I turned in early, crawling into my sleeping bag and pulling the zipper almost all the way to the top. The tent flapped lightly in the wind, not bad, just enough to keep the desert quiet from being too quiet. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what time it was. My watch was in my backpack near the door. It was still pitch black out. I could see a sliver of moon through the mesh top of the tent, enough to make out the lines of the tent poles and my gear bag at my feet. I didn't know what woke me at first. There wasn't a sound at all, just the wind, soft and steady. I lay still for a minute, breathing quiet, listening. Then I heard it, sobbing. It was faint, not like movie sobbing, not over the top. Just a slow, steady, broken sound. A person crying, trying to stay quiet, but not succeeding. The kind of sound someone makes when they think they're alone. It was coming from the direction of the rocks, the direction of the cross. My first instinct was that I wasn't alone out here, that someone else had come by, maybe found the memorial and got emotional. It was a big stretch of land, and I hadn't seen any vehicles, but that didn't mean much. People hike out here all the time. Maybe someone else knew about EJ. Maybe someone had come out here to grieve. But even as I told myself that, I was already unzipping the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound. As soon as I got the flap open and stepped out, the sobbing stopped. Not faded, not moved, just gone. Cut off mid-breath like a radio switched off. The wind picked up a little, brushing against my face. The air felt colder now, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees while I slept. I stood barefoot in the dirt, heart beating fast, staring out into the darkness where I knew the rocks were. I couldn't see them from here, too far, too dark, but I knew the direction. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. Eventually, I climbed back into the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I didn't hear the sound again. No more crying. Just wind and distant coyote calls, the kind that echo in a way that makes them hard to place. I lay there, eyes open, watching the stars through the mesh, thinking about the pile of rocks and the initials on that cross. EJ. When the first light came, I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't even stretch. Just rolled the tent up, tossed everything in the truck bed, and got behind the wheel. But I couldn't leave right away, not without going back to the rocks. I walked out there again, boots crunching on the dirt and gravel. The sun hadn't fully come up yet, but I could see fine. The rocks were the same. Nothing had changed. No signs of anyone else. No footprints, no gear, no candle wax or flowers or whatever else people sometimes leave behind at memorials. I crouched down and looked closer. The metal cross was more rusted than I remembered. Maybe it was just the light. I looked around again. Nothing. No movement. I stood up, gave one last glance, and walked back to the truck. I drove out slow. The same dirt road, the same ruts and dips. The sun was rising behind me, lighting up the land in that golden Utah way that makes everything look sharper, more real. I didn't feel scared. Not really, but I felt something. A weight. Like whatever happened out there wasn't finished, just paused. Like I had touched something that didn't want to be touched. I stopped at a gas station an hour later, filled up, grabbed coffee, and asked the guy behind the counter if he knew anything about a grave or memorial out on that stretch of BLM land. I didn't mention the sobbing, just the rocks, the cross, the initials. He thought for a second, rubbing his chin. EJ? He asked. That does sound kind of familiar. There was a guy, long time ago now, who went missing out that way. Back in the 90s, I think. Hiker, maybe a prospector. Not sure. Never found him. Folks figured he got lost in the heat or fell down a canyon. Might be someone left that for him. But hell, that land's full of old stories. You see weird things out there if you stay long enough. I nodded, thanked him, and got back in the truck. I didn't feel better or worse. Just clearer. Sometimes things don't make sense. Sometimes you don't get the whole story. Maybe someone really did go out there to cry, and I just missed them. Maybe it was an animal sound warped by wind. Maybe my brain heard something that wasn't there, triggered by the cross, the rust, the isolation. But I know what I heard, and I know the way it stopped when I stepped out. I haven't been back to that spot. I marked it on my map, circled it in red this time. Not as a destination, but as a reminder, A warning, maybe. The land remembers things, even if we don't. It holds on to them in silence, in rust, in the weight of stones stacked by hand. And sometimes, if you're real quiet, it lets you hear it too. Camping in northern Maine isn't for everyone. It's quiet, it's thick with trees and bugs, and it feels like the land is older than people are meant to be. Me and my buddy Jason had gone out for a week in early October. The leaves were already halfway through turning, and the air had that sharp bite to it that you only get up north. Not the kind of cold that chills you to the bone, but the kind that keeps you alert. The kind that smells like dead leaves and wood smoke and frost. We both like that. We'd done a few trips together, Vermont, the Catskills, even up to Quebec once, but something about Maine always called to us. The size of it, the emptiness. We weren't in Baxter or anything official. This was way off grid, maybe 20 miles from the nearest dirt road, and another 50 from anything that would show up on a GPS. I'm not exaggerating. We'd both done plenty of backcountry stuff before, and we were comfortable going deep. We brought topo maps, a compass, and 2 weeks of food, even though we only planned to stay out for one. You just never know. If you get hurt out there, no one's coming. You better be ready to wait or fix it yourself. The first few days were just what we wanted. We hiked in along an old logging trail that had mostly been swallowed by the forest. No tire tracks, no sign of people. Just moose scat, fresh bare prints in the mud, and the silence that settles in places too far out for cell towers or traffic or even airplanes. There was a stream nearby, clean enough to drink from once we boiled it, and we found a perfect flat spot on a rise about 100 feet off the water. We pitched the tent there, 2-man, bright orange, waterproofed, and with a good ground tarp underneath. We'd spent our first night cooking rice and beans on the little alcohol stove, watching the dark creep in around us like a slow tide. It got real quiet after sundown. No frogs, no crickets, just wind in the trees and the occasional snap of something moving in the brush. I remember sleeping light that first night. Always do when I'm deep in the woods. Not scared, just tuned in. You hear things, branches shifting, maybe a fox yipping way off, or the sudden crack of something big stepping wrong. But nothing bothered us. I woke up a couple times, checked my watch, and drifted off again. The cold seeped in around 3 a.m. like always, and I pulled my bag tighter, but otherwise, no problems. The second day, we did a long loop hike just exploring. Bushwhacking mostly. We saw a big bull moose about half a mile out, just standing in the bog, watching us like we were ants. His antlers looked like the roots of a dead tree, heavy and crooked. We didn't get too close. Took a few photos and moved on. Found some weird cuts in a pine tree. Looked like someone had peeled the bark off in long strips, maybe a bear or maybe someone marking the tree for tapping. Hard to say. The cuts looked old. We didn't think much of it. Just another little curiosity you find when you're far enough from people. The night we got back late, nearly dusk, made dinner in the last light, and climbed into the tent early. It was colder than the night before, but we were worn out and fell asleep fast. I remember rolling over around midnight because the ground felt different somehow, softer maybe or warmer. Could have just been my body adjusting. I didn't think much of it, but in the morning, things were different. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into air that smelled weird. Not bad. Not like something rotting or burning, just off. Like bleach, almost. Real faint, but there. The first thing I noticed was the pine needles. Or really, the lack of them. Where before we'd been on a normal forest floor, soft with years of dropped pine needles. Now we were sitting in a perfect circle of bare dirt. I mean perfect, 10 feet across, maybe a little more, and the needles were gone down to the dirt like someone had raked or swept them all away during the night. Not kicked, not trampled, just gone. Not a stick, not a cone, not even a leaf. Just exposed dirt. Damp, cold, and clean. Everything outside the circle looked normal. You could see the edge clear as day, a sharp line where the debris stopped and the clean dirt started. I didn't say anything right away, just stood there staring. My boots sunk a little into the dirt and it felt soft. Not muddy, just like it had been loosened, like someone had tilled it lightly with a rake. I looked up and around. Nothing hanging from the trees. No new tracks that I could see, human, or animal, just our boot prints from the day before leading off toward the stream. Jason came out a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and stretching. He looked at the ground and stopped mid-yawn. He just stood there, hands on his hips, scanning the circle like he was trying to figure out a trick. We didn't say much, just kind of circled around the tent, checking for prints or signs that we were missing something obvious. Nothing. No drag marks, no bent twigs, no tire tracks. The soil didn't look disturbed beyond what I said, just sort of raked, not dug. And it wasn't like the pine needles had blown away in the wind. There hadn't been wind. The trees around us weren't even swaying. And even if there had been wind, it wouldn't leave a circle like that. It would scatter stuff in one direction, not evenly away from center point. This looked intentional. Still, we tried to come up with explanations. Maybe a bear sniffing around, pawing at the ground. But there were no claw marks, no dung, no prints. And a bear doesn't clean in a circle. Maybe some kind of fungus or mold. But again, no signs, just dirt. We even joked, half-heartedly, that maybe it was some weird Forest Service thing. But why would they come 20 miles out to sweep around our tent while we slept? And how would they do it without waking us up? We decided not to stay in that spot another night. Neither of us said we were spooked, but I think we both were. I could see it in the way we kept glancing at the trees, the way we packed up faster than usual. There's something about realizing that someone or something was near you while you slept, close enough to reach out and touch you. That turned your stomach, especially when you have no idea who or why. We moved camp that day, heading up along the ridge and over to a new site a few miles away. It wasn't as good, rocky ground, less shelter, but we felt better putting some distance between us and that circle. Still, the unease didn't go away. That night, I kept hearing little noises just outside the range of clear hearing. Nothing distinct. No footsteps or voices. Just movement. A shift in the underbrush. A tree creaking wrong. That feeling that you're not alone. Next morning, we checked around again. Nothing unusual. No circle, no missing needles. Just a normal patch of forest. We stayed one more night after that, not sleeping much, and then decided to cut the trip short by 2 days. We didn't talk much on the hike out, just kept our eyes forward and our ears open. Back at the car, we tried to laugh it off. Said maybe it was some animal behavior we didn't know about. Maybe porcupines nesting, or some kind of nesting ground for insects, or whatever. We didn't really believe it, but it made us feel better to say it. It stayed with me after that. The image of that circle. The way it was so neat, so precise. Like whoever made it cared about being clean. Not careless, not messy. Like it was meant to be seen. I found myself thinking about it at night, lying in bed in my warm house, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would have happened if we'd woken up while it was being made. What we would have seen standing there. A couple months later, I called a friend of mine who works for a conservation group. He's done a lot of time in the woods, Maine included. I told him the story, just to see if he'd heard anything similar. He was quiet for a second, then told me it didn't sound like any animal behavior he knew. He asked for the GPS coordinates, and I gave him the closest I could remember. He promised to look into it, maybe send someone by in the spring when the snow melted. He called me back a few weeks later, said they'd done some checking. There wasn't anything unusual in that area as far as reports or wildlife patterns. But he did mention something that stuck with me. He said that when old-time surveyors used to work those woods back in the early 1900s, they'd sometimes clear circles to mark spots for long-term projects, rail lines, logging points, even secret mapping stations. Circles made with rakes and shovels. Neat, deliberate. He said it might just be an old site resurfacing after years of erosion or tree fall. That the forest moves and shifts, and maybe we camped on top of something that had been buried for a long time. Maybe that's true. Maybe the forest finally coughed something up. Or maybe someone was there that night, watching us sleep and clearing the ground in the dark for reasons I don't want to understand. Either way, I haven't been back to Maine since. And I think about that circle more often than I'd like. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything and head into the desert. No plans, no schedule, just me, the truck, and a few days of quiet. I drove until the road gave out somewhere north of the Tonto National Forest, pushing down a dirt trail barely wide enough for the truck. No signs, no fences, nothing but open land and rock and cacti stretching for miles in every direction. The kind of place where people didn't just stumble across you. That's what I wanted. I found a flat stretch tucked between two rocky hills, just enough to block some wind, but open enough to see the stars. The kind of silence that makes you think your ears stopped working at first. No wind, no insects, not even birds. Just that vast, empty stillness that swallows up sound. I set up a small camp. Didn't bring a tent, just a ground pad, sleeping bag, and a tarp in case weather rolled in. The sky was clear, sunset slow and deep orange, painting the rocks and dirt with that kind of glow you only see in the desert. I gathered what dry brush I could find, started a small fire with my lighter and some cotton balls soaked in petroleum jelly I kept in an old Altoids tin. Dinner was just canned beans, a hunk of bread, and a cheap bottle of whiskey I didn't plan on drinking much of. I sat back, propped against a big flat rock warmed by the fire, and let the heat sink in. The air cooled fast once the sun was gone. The fire crackled steady. I remember how peaceful it felt. I let my eyes close, still sitting up, just resting. Then I heard it, a soft humming, not from a phone, not from the wind, not mechanical. A human voice, a woman, low, gentle, almost like a lullaby, but without any words. I was half asleep, and for a second I thought I was dreaming. I opened my eyes and immediately felt cold, wide awake and alert like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over my head. My heart kicked up hard, and I sat up straight. Across the fire, not 10 feet away, was a figure crouched low to the ground. A woman. I could see her clearly in the firelight. Long black hair hanging over her face, arms at her sides, crouched like she was about to spring forward. She wasn't moving, but her head was tilted slightly like she was watching me. Her eyes, they looked white, not glowing or anything, just white like they had no pupils. Her skin was pale, smudged with dirt. She was barefoot. I didn't move, didn't say a word. My flashlight was beside me, just within reach, and I grabbed it as slow as I could. The moment I clicked it on and pointed it toward her, she was gone. Just gone. No movement, no noise, nothing. Like she hadn't even been there. But she had been. I know what I saw. I was awake. I wasn't dreaming. The fire was still burning, the rocks still warm under me, and I could still feel the sound of that humming ringing in my ears. I stood up, shining the flashlight around the camp. Nothing, just a brush, the hills, the endless dark. But then I saw the footprints. Barefoot prints, small, circling the fire. They weren't mine. I wore boots, and mine were still by my bedroll. These were bare, and they were fresh. I followed them around the fire, and they stopped right where she crouched. No leading in or out, just a loop around my fire and nothing more. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, stayed sitting with my back to the rock, flashlight and my knife in hand. I listened for anything, footsteps, branches breaking, that humming. But there was nothing, just silence. I stayed like that until the sky turned gray. At first light, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat, just threw my gear into the truck and drove, fast as I could without wrecking the axle. I had no signal until I hit the paved road almost 3 hours later. I didn't call anyone. What would I even say? I told myself maybe it was a person, some drifter or someone living off-grid. But that didn't make sense. There was nothing out there. No water, no food, no shelter, and no reason for anyone to be walking barefoot through the desert at night. And those footprints, if it had been someone, they would have led somewhere. Instead, they just stopped like she appeared out of nowhere. Still, I try to be rational. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Or maybe the fire played tricks on my eyes. I told myself that over and over, but it never settled right. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? The hairs on your arms stand up, your stomach drops, and your body goes cold. I felt that as soon as I saw her. And that's not something your brain makes up just because you're tired. A few weeks later, I went back. Not to the same spot, but close. I wanted to prove something to myself, maybe get answers, I don't know. I brought better gear this time, trail cams, a buddy with a scoped rifle, even motion lights. We stayed 3 nights. Nothing happened. Not a thing. We didn't even hear coyotes. It was like the desert just swallowed up all sound again. That same heavy silence, but no woman, no footprints, no humming. My buddy thought I was messing with him by telling the story. He laughed it off, called it a bad dream, or maybe dehydration. I let him believe that. I haven't gone back to that exact spot. I marked it on my GPS, and sometimes I look at the coordinates. I think about going again just to sit there and wait, but I don't. Not because I'm afraid, not exactly, but because I already know what happened. I saw what I saw. I don't need to explain it to anyone. People think the desert is empty, but it's not. It's full of silence, heat, and space, and sometimes that space isn't as empty as you think. Sometimes it watches back. And if you're out there, alone by your fire, and you hear humming, don't look up. Just pack your things, get in your truck, and drive. Because whatever I saw out there didn't want to be seen, and I don't think it was finished. I don't know what made me stop, but there I was, standing in the middle of a clearing, staring at the broken remnants of an old mirror half buried in the dirt. The thing looked ancient. The glass was cracked, pieces missing, and the frame was so weathered it looked like it might crumble to dust at any moment. The kind of thing you'd find tucked away in some abandoned house, forgotten and left to rot. I've been hiking with my friend for days, and the woods around us had started to feel more and more isolating with each mile. We were a few days in on a backpacking trip through some remote wilderness, the kind of place where the trees were dense and the trail barely visible. Most people didn't come here, and the only noise we heard was the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and the sound of our boots hitting the earth. It was peaceful, sure, but in a way that made everything feel eerily quiet. When I spotted the mirror, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a relic from an old campsite or something. I knelt down to inspect it. There was something odd about the way it caught the light, like it was reflecting something that wasn't there. I didn't give it a second thought, at least not until later. I picked it up and wiped away the dirt on the glass. It was old, scratched up, but I could still see my reflection in the surface. Something about the way the reflection looked bothered me, though. The face staring back at me didn't seem quite right. It was like I was seeing it from too far away, almost like it was distorted or out of place. But I chalked it up to the cracks and damage to the glass. Probably just the way the light was hitting it. I joked to my friend that I'd found a mirror of bad luck, and that we'd be doomed from that moment on. We both laughed, brushing it off. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We had set up camp a little farther down the trail, tucked away beside a creek that babbled quietly in the background. It should have been peaceful, but my mind kept drifting back to the mirror. I couldn't explain why, but it nagged at me. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the night air chilly and crisp. The trees above us rustled in the wind, but there was something almost too still about the world around us. My friend was already snoring lightly beside me, and I tried to focus on the sound of the creek to calm my racing thoughts. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I remember waking up in a dream, if that makes sense. I was standing in front of the cracked mirror again, but this time, the reflection was different. I could see myself clearly, but I wasn't moving. My reflection stood still, staring back at me. But in my dream, I was moving. I reached out to touch the glass, but the reflection didn't match. It was like I was watching myself from the outside, trapped in the mirror, while the me in the dream went on, as if nothing was wrong. I felt the sharpest sense of unease then. It was as if something was pulling at me, urging me to step forward to touch the glass, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away either. In the dream, my reflection still stood perfectly still, but whoever I was in the dream, was moving. My hand was shaking as I reached toward the mirror, and for a split second, I could feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Then everything went black, and I woke up at the start. I gasped, disoriented, blinking at the darkness around me. The sound of my breathing was loud in my ears, but I could hear my friend snoring beside me. I didn't want to wake them up, but my heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know if it was the dream or the odd feeling that still clung to the back of my mind, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I rolled over, staring up at the stars through the gap in the trees. I tried to push the thought of the mirror away, but it stuck with me. I had no idea why I felt so uneasy. It wasn't like me to get worked up over something so insignificant, but there it was, an uncomfortable pressure building in my chest. Morning came slowly, and I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the sunlight creeping through the trees. My friend was already sitting up, rubbing their eyes, looking groggy but content. The night had passed without incident, and I hoped that whatever weird feeling had gripped me during the dream would fade with the light of day. But it didn't. As we packed up our camp, my friend casually mentioned that I'd been sleep-talking the night before. I blinked, surprised. I didn't talk in my sleep. At least, I didn't think I did. It went on. You were saying some weird stuff, though. It didn't sound like you at all. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Like, your voice. It wasn't yours. It sounded deeper, almost raspy, and you kept talking about mirrors. You kept saying something like, it's not real. You have to move. You can't stay here. My friend shrugged, clearly not too worried, but I could see the curiosity in their eyes. It was creepy. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to process what they'd said. My voice, not mine. Talking about mirrors. It all came rushing back to me. The dream, the reflection, the feeling of being pulled toward the mirror. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a part of me was missing. It didn't feel like a normal dream. It felt too vivid, too real. I didn't tell my friend about the dream I'd had. I didn't want to sound paranoid. And frankly, I wasn't sure what to believe myself. The day passed like any other. We hiked through the dense woods, the sun beating down through the leaves, the smell of pine and dirt thick in the air. We didn't talk much, both of us wrapped up in our own thoughts. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that hadn't been there before. We made camp that evening in another small clearing just off the trail. I was too tired to think much about the mirror or the strange dream, but it still lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. When we settled down for the night, I made a point to stay as far away from the spot where I'd found the mirror. I didn't want to think about it anymore. But that night, the dream came back. This time, I wasn't standing in front of the mirror. I was lying in my sleeping bag, the tent walls faintly illuminated by the moonlight. I could see my reflection on the inside of the tent wall, but it wasn't right. The image was distorted, stretched out like a funhouse mirror. It didn't look like me. The face was familiar, but there was something wrong about it. I could hear myself breathing, slow and steady, but the reflection in the tent didn't match. It was like I was seeing it from the outside, but I wasn't moving. I tried to look away, but my eyes couldn't leave the reflection. It felt like I was locked in place, trapped by my own image. And then I saw it. My reflection, the one on the wall of the tent, smiled. But I didn't. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I was frozen, unable to move. The smile in the reflection grew wider, too wide, until the face was almost unrecognizable. And then the face changed, became something darker, more sinister. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't. I couldn't break the hold it had on me. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel my hands trembling. My friend was snoring beside me, completely unaware of what I'd just experienced. I sat up in the dark, trying to calm my breath, but the lingering sense of dread wouldn't leave. It felt like something was still watching me. The rest of the trip passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream, whatever it was, hadn't been a coincidence. I kept thinking about the mirror, about the way it had looked, how it had drawn me in. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know what. When we finally made it back to civilization, I never spoke of it again, but the memory stayed with me. That night in the tent, and the reflection that wasn't mine. The voice that didn't sound like mine. I tried to tell myself it was just a strange coincidence, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Maybe I had just imagined it all. Maybe I hadn't. I'll never know. But I can't bring myself to go back to that place. Not to the clearing where I found the mirror. And sometimes, when I look into any mirror, I feel a strange unease, like something is watching me from the other side. I don't talk about it to anyone. It's just a feeling, but it's enough to make me wonder if maybe, just maybe, I should have left that mirror where I found it. Night came down hard in the Ozarks, like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second, the forest was dipped in gold. The next, it was gone, replaced by a thick blackness that swallowed everything except the sounds of the woods. I was tucked in for the night, strung between two sturdy oaks in my hammock. Rainfly pitched overhead just in case the weather turned. I'd hiked in that afternoon, maybe 6 miles off the gravel Forest Service road, down past a dry creek bed and up into a hollow that didn't get much foot traffic. It was the kind of place I liked, quiet, away from people, nothing but trees and old stone and wind. The day had gone smooth. I'd made good time getting in and had plenty of daylight to set up camp. I'd boiled some rice and beans on my stove and sipped hot coffee as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The air was cool for early fall, but not bad. No sign of rain, though the sky had that pale, washed-out look that made me think it might turn in a day or two. Still, I felt good about the spot. The trees were healthy. No widowmakers overhead. I even strung up a bear bag, just like I should, even though I'd never seen a bear this far east in Arkansas. I laid in the hammock with my sleeping bag pulled up over me, headlamp turned off, just listening to the frogs and crickets. I must have been dozing for maybe half an hour, not fully asleep, not fully awake when I heard the first knock. It was sharp, like someone rapping on a tree trunk with a piece of wood. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. I opened my eyes and stared up into the black. The knocks were close, maybe 40 yards away, but sound moves funny at night. I figured it might have been a branch falling or a woodpecker messing around after dark. But it wasn't quite like that. It was deliberate, clean, like someone meant for it to be heard. I sat up in the hammock, slowly, careful not to rock too much. My headlamp was clipped to the ridgeline above me, but I didn't reach for it. I just listened. Silence. Then again, knock, 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 pause, knock, knock. A rhythm. Not fast, not rushed. Just steady, like whoever, or whatever, was making it wasn't in a hurry. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon messing with something. That happens. They can knock sticks together or kick loose bark. But I'd never heard that kind of pattern before. I stayed still, barely breathing. The air had that cold edge now, like the temperature dropped a good 10 degrees since sundown. My breath felt thick in my throat. A minute passed, then the knocks came again. Farther off this time, maybe up the ridge behind me. Same pattern. I finally reached up and grabbed my headlamp. Clicked it on. Beam cut through the dark like a blade, but it didn't land on anything. Just trees, brush, the empty woods. I scanned the area around my hammock. Nothing looked disturbed. No, I shine in the dark. I clicked the light off and lay back, but sleep didn't come. Every few minutes, the knocking started up again, and each time it was from a new direction. Sometimes close, sometimes far. Always that same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. It circled me. That's what it felt like it was moving around, keeping to the shadows, staying just out of sight. Hours passed that way. I remember checking my watch. It was nearly 2:30 in the morning. The knocking never stopped for long. 10, maybe 15 minutes of quiet, then there it was again. At one point, I heard it right downhill from me, in the same dry creek bed I'd passed earlier that day. The sound echoed up the hollow. That one got to me. My mouth went dry. I gripped my pocket knife in my sleeping bag, like that would help if someone was actually out there. That's when I started thinking about the old stories. Not ghost stories or fairy tales, but the real ones. About people who go missing in places like this. I thought about how easy it'd be to vanish out here. No cell service, no roads nearby, no one to hear you scream if something went wrong. My camp was hidden. No way anyone would have seen it from a trail, even if they were looking. But the knocking kept coming, like someone knew exactly where I was. I wanted to believe it was animals just acting weird, maybe woodpeckers nesting late, or even another camper being stupid. But deep down, I didn't buy that. It was too specific, too constant. I didn't hear footsteps or voices, but the movement was real. It kept circling, always staying out of reach. At one point, I heard leaves crunching lightly like someone walking slow. Not heavy footsteps, but just enough to notice if you were really listening. It passed maybe 20 feet from my hammock, low to the ground, barely there. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound faded, and then the knock started again from the opposite side. I never saw a flashlight, never heard talking. If it was someone messing with me, they were serious about it. Focused, smart enough to keep their light off and stay out of sight. I stayed awake until dawn. Never slept a second. By 4:30, the birds started chirping again. First just one, then a few more. The black sky turned gray. I watched it brighten from inside my bag, every second stretching out like an hour. And just like that, the knocking stopped. No final pattern, no fading away. Just silence. I waited another hour before moving. I wanted full daylight, and even then, I moved slow. Packed up without eating breakfast. I didn't even make coffee. Just dropped the rain fly, stuffed everything into my pack, and kept my knife in my hand the whole time. I didn't look around much. Didn't go searching for tracks or clues. I didn't want to know. Whatever it was, it hadn't come into camp, hadn't touched anything, hadn't spoken a word, but had watched. I knew that much. It had watched me all night. I hiked fast, took a different way out, bushwhacked over a low ridge instead of going back through the dry creek bed. My pack snagged a few times on thorns, and I nearly twisted my ankle stepping over a hidden root, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I reached the gravel road and saw my truck. I slammed the door behind me when I got in. Just sat there a minute with my head against the steering wheel. The whole cab of the truck smelled like the woods and sweat and adrenaline. I felt like I just walked out of something I wasn't supposed to survive. I never told anyone about it for a long time. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know what to say. There's nothing dramatic to it. No creature in the trees. No glowing eyes. No shadow figure creeping through the woods. Just knocks. Always knocks. And the knowledge deep in my chest that I was being hunted. Not chased, not attacked, but hunted. Watched. Studied. The strangest part was how controlled it all felt. Like whatever it was didn't want to scare me off, at least not too fast. It wanted me awake. Aware. It wanted me to hear the pattern. Weeks later, back at home, I thought about it again. Tried to look up wooden knocking patterns. Found some stories, some theories, Sasquatch stuff mostly, which I didn't believe. But I also found some hunting forums. People talking about old methods for flushing game from the brush using sound. Patterns to disorient prey. Trap it between noises, confuse it, make it move where you want it to go. I thought about that a lot. About what it means to be prey. I still hike, still camp, but I haven't gone back to the Ozarks. I stay closer to towns now, or at least within cell service. I always tell someone exactly where I'm going, and I sleep with a headlamp on my chest and my knife within reach. Every now and then I dream about it, about those knocks echoing through the trees. 3, pause. 2, circling, closer, always closer, but never again at sunrise. That part never comes. It was mid-September, somewhere in the hills of northern Pennsylvania. I had driven out alone, past the last little town with gas and groceries, down a winding gravel road that didn't even have a name on my GPS. I'd picked the spot carefully, far enough from the main roads that I wouldn't see or hear anyone, but still accessible by my old pickup. I parked where the road split into 2 overgrown trails and followed the eastern one on foot for about half a mile. There was a clearing near a small creek with moss-covered rocks and thick pines ringing the space. It looked like no one had been there in a long time. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent on the flattest ground I could find, right in the middle of the clearing. It was a basic one-person tent, low and narrow, just tall enough to sit up in. The ground underneath was soft with a mix of loam and pine needles and a few roots pushed up here and there. I cleared what I could and laid down my sleeping pad and bag. I gathered some wood, made a small fire pit with rocks, and cooked a simple meal, beans and rice with some jerky. It was quiet out there. No cars, no airplanes, just the breeze moving through the trees and the occasional crack of a twig somewhere off in the woods. I spent the evening reading with my flashlight and listening to the night settle in. There were crickets and the odd hoot of an owl. Nothing out of the ordinary. I put out the fire by 9 and crawled into the tent. My phone was off. No service anyway. I rolled up my coat as a pillow and zipped myself into the bag. The forest was dark, but not eerie. Just thick and full of shadows. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. No sound woke me. It was just that feeling you get when you suddenly know something's different. The air was cold against my nose. I could see my breath a little in the beam of moonlight that pushed through the tent fabric. I lay there trying to go back to sleep, but I felt off. Then I felt it. A small push upward from the floor of the tent, right under my lower back. Just a little bump at first, soft but firm enough that it wasn't my imagination. I froze. The pressure lifted for a second, then returned, moving slightly. Slowly, it pushed toward my shoulder blades, then toward my side, then paused. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I tried to think. Was it a mole? A groundhog? Could something be under there? But nothing big could have dug through that dirt without me hearing it. I listened hard. No sound. Not even a breeze now. No insects. Just that feeling under my body of something moving, something shifting gently, deliberately, like it knew I was there but didn't care. It kept sliding beneath me for another few seconds, maybe 10, maybe 20. It passed under my ribs, then my hips, and finally under my legs. Then nothing. I waited a long time. I don't know how long. My muscles started to ache from staying so still. Finally, I moved a little. Just a twitch. Nothing happened. I slowly turned to my side, careful not to shift too much weight. Still nothing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stared at the top of the tent, cold sweat drying on my neck. Every few minutes I thought I heard something, twigs snapping, soft rustling, but it could have just been my imagination at that point. I told myself not to open the tent until sunrise. When the first light came in, soft and gray and cold, I unzipped the door slowly and crawled out. My back and neck were stiff. I stood and looked around. The woods looked like they always did, wet with morning dew, silent and empty. But I couldn't stop myself from walking around to the back of the tent. I flipped it over. There in the dirt was a long smear. It started at the far edge of where I had slept and ended at the other side of the tent, about the width of a basketball, maybe a bit less. The pine needles and loam were disturbed, flattened, like something thick and heavy had slithered through. No tracks, no claw marks, just a smooth, winding drag through the soil, like something long and low had passed beneath me. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't take a picture. I don't know why. It didn't feel like something I wanted to document. I just stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing. My brain ran through options: snake? Eel. But what kind of snake pushes upward through packed dirt like that? And what could be long enough to stretch from one side of my tent to the other, thick enough to press against my body? I walked the perimeter of the clearing, searching for more signs. Nothing. No scat. No fur. No broken branches. Just that one long smear beneath where I'd slept. I packed up fast. Didn't even eat breakfast. My gut was tight the whole time, like I was being watched. Back at the truck, I loaded everything in quick, checked the tires, and turned around on the trail, crunching back over rocks and roots until I hit the gravel road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 towns over, where I finally breathed normal again. I didn't talk to anyone about it for a while. There's no good way to explain it. I wasn't attacked. I wasn't harmed. But something came close. Close enough to slide underneath me without making a sound. And the worst part is not knowing what it was, or if it ever left the area. Every now and then, I go back in my head and think, what if I had moved? What if I had screamed? Would it have stayed underneath me? Or would it have come up? A few months later, I went to a library and pulled out books on local wildlife. I thought maybe it had been a large snake. Pennsylvania has timber rattlers and black rat snakes. Both can get big, over 6 feet. But even those don't burrow under tents. They don't push through from underground. And nothing I found explained the sheer size of that smear or the deliberate way it moved. One naturalist told me some large snakes will overwinter in dens underground and can move through burrows made by other animals. That maybe I'd set my tent up over a tunnel. But he also said if it had been a snake that big, I would have heard it. Maybe felt more than just a slow push. Another guy told me it could have been a fisher or a mink, something low and curious, sliding through looking for food. But I've seen fishers before. They don't move like that. They don't make a trail that wide. And they don't silently slide under people in the night. I never went back to that spot. I don't even remember exactly how to get there. I burned the old topo map I used to mark the area. Just tossed it into a fire one night and watched the ink curl into smoke. Not because I was scared of what was there, but because I realized I didn't want to know. I didn't want to dig deeper. Sometimes, it's better to let the unknown stay where it is. I still camp, still hike, but I'm more careful now. I test the ground harder. I listen longer. And I never, ever sleep directly on soft dirt anymore. Because something moved under me once. And it wasn't a dream. It wasn't a story. It was real. Something crawled beneath my body while I lay frozen in the dark. And whatever it was, it knew I was there. I just don't think it cared.